Oh. Oh, God. Hey. Are you okay?
What happened?
I don't know. Oh, gee. It looks like you finished your script, though.
What?
Your script. It looks like you finished it.
I'm free.
Huh?
Don't you understand? I'm free.
Okay.
I'm free. Okay. I started writing this script during spring break on March 18 of 2023. I am so fucking tired. I feel like I've aged like 3,000 years. For the sake of context, when I first watched Pahkitew Island, I promised myself I would never watch it again because I just thought it was genuinely that bad. But during the production of my first video, I began to rethink that since I liked it so much less than All Stars and felt like it was more deserving of a video like this. I didn't want to do it immediately since, like I said in my first video, I didn't want people to expect total drama content from me, but since I got free access to Premiere Pro through my school, I eventually decided that I ought to start working on this video before I graduated, and then I graduated, so... If you have any better options for free editing software, please drop them in the comments. I'm going to need it. But other than that, I should probably start talking about the rewrite itself before I start losing you. You specifically. Unlike All Stars, I'm not going to put as many restrictions on myself this time. The episode count will be raised to 15, and the teams will be slightly different, but the biggest changes I have to make will be to the characters, since they're probably the worst new cast of any season. This is not a new take. As far as I can tell, most people agree that everyone besides Jasmine and Sean were annoying and one-dimensional, and even they won't be exempt from modifications. However, I think the best place to start making changes is at the end, since the finalists and villain are what the whole season will be structured around. So instead of letting Sugar and Sky be part of this season's final three, they will be replaced by Amy and Sammy. As written, Amy and Sammy honestly aren't that much better than Sugar or Sky. Amy is just a one-note bully, and Sammy is a blank slate that we learn nothing about beyond the fact that she's being abused. But the reason I'm replacing Sugar and Sky rather than modifying them to better fit their roles is that Amy and Sammy's relationship predates the show, which means it can be leveraged for drama from the get-go. Unlike Sky, who never developed a meaningful relationship with Sean or Sugar despite starting on the same team, Amy and Sammy have the building blocks for an intense sibling rivalry that can hold Sammy over to the finale. However, for this to work, Amy needs to be less bratty and more conniving. Amy is already sufficiently nasty towards Sammy in the show, but her childish need for attention undermines the menace of her character, and the lack of motivation behind her abuse of Sammy makes her cruelty feel kind of token. That's not to say there'd ever be a good reason for her to abuse her sister, just that there isn't a strong internal logic to her actions beyond being, like, the evil twin. So in this rewrite, Amy's harassment of Sammy will specifically be driven by her desire to maintain superiority over her. That way she has a consistent internal justification to lash out at Sammy in more organized and deliberate ways while still incorporating her self-centeredness. Additionally, Amy's insults will be a lot more subdued, so she doesn't come off so cartoonishly mean. By contrast, Sammy won't change much on a conceptual level, but her increased screen time will allow her story to be paced more gradually than it was in canon. She'll have more opportunities to develop outside of her sister's influence, her friendship with Sammy will be more central to the story, and she'll even have a hand in advancing Sean and Jasmine's romantic subplot. Jasmine herself will also be pretty similar to her canon counterpart since she's undeniably the most well-rounded character in the cast, but her friendship with Sammy will receive more attention and have more time to be fleshed out. On the other hand, while she'll still end up with Sean, their relationship will be very different because he's no longer a zombie conspiracy theorist. This will probably be one of the more controversial changes because it strays away from his namesake and most people seem to like Sean, but I wanted to make this change because Sean's zombie obsession made him impossible to take seriously. I'd have no problem if Sean was just a teen who fantasized about how he'd survive a zombie apocalypse, and then his preparations just got a little out of hand. But literally believing that zombies are real is just a little too far for me, at least. It doesn't help that Sean's dialogue is mostly comprised of zombie references, which makes him feel incredibly one-dimensional, but the fact that his obsession is also the cause of both of his arguments with Jasmine is especially frustrating, since we know they're basically fighting over nothing. That's why I'm making Sean more of a general horror fan instead of a conspiracy theorist. He'll still have a special interest in zombie movies that inspired him to do survival training in the first place, but regardless, this approach to Sean's character grounds his interest in something an actual teenager would do, while still keeping his skill set intact. That way he can remain a formidable opponent for Sammy in the finale, but he can also have more casual conversations with Jasmine about horror as well as the competition. And with Sean out of the way, we've finished covering the 4 main characters of the season. However, given how intertwined Sammy, Jasmine, and Sean are, This setup raises one big question. How is Amy supposed to reach the semifinals if she's so thoroughly outnumbered? The only way she could feasibly survive is if she had an ally that was strong enough to help her win challenges, yet loyal enough to ignore her obvious abusive behavior, and that's what brings us to Rodney. In the show, you could say that Rodney was a bit easily infatuated. He thought every girl he fell in love with was his girlfriend, and while that's very creepy on paper, I never really minded this aspect of his character because he never crossed any of the girls' boundaries and was functionally harmless. However, what did bother me was the missed potential of this character flaw. Instant infatuation is just such an easily exploitable weakness that is honestly baffling that the writers didn't think to use it as the basis for some kind of deep relationship, which is something this season sorely needs. So in this rewrite, Rodney will still fall in love with multiple girls on his team, but he'll do so one at a time rather than all at once. His heart will be broken over and over again as each crush falls through, until eventually, Sammy leaves the team and Amy needs a new lackey. This will lead Amy to take advantage of Rodney's emotionally vulnerable state. However, she will face some resistance in the form of Beardo. For context, the other part of Rodney that irritated me after rewatching Pahkitew Island was how he struggled to form sentences for the majority of his time on the show. It makes sense that he would get flustered around his crushes, and is a character trait that I feel is worth keeping, but he really needed a friend that he could talk to normally so he wasn't just mumbling half his lines. And since Beardo didn't do much in the show anyway, I kinda just chose him. This might seem like kind of a weird choice given that Topher probably would have made a more convincing wingman based on his looks and personality, but since my version of Topher is focused squarely on Chris, I don't see him interacting with the other contestants that much. By contrast, Beardo will essentially just have the character arc outlined in his audition tape, where he starts off shy but turns out to be kind of a chill dude once he opens up, and Rodney will be the main catalyst for this change. They'll continue to be friends until Amy gets in the way and eliminates Beardo, but with that in mind, now's actually the perfect time to segue back to the beginning of the season to see who will go home first instead of Beardo. It's Leonard. Besides acting and costume design, Leonard's skills just aren't that useful outside of total drama action, whereas Beardo's vocal talents are at least theoretically useful for tricking opponents or winning a talent show. So aside from going one episode earlier, Leonard will essentially just be the same. By contrast, I'm dragging Topher all the way down to second place because his plan to steal Chris's job was so convoluted that it's not even worth rewriting. He didn't impact Chris or any of the other contestants, so it's not like this rewrite loses anything by eliminating him early. And since I'm not doing his whole job-stealing scheme, he'll just be a straightforward Chris fanboy instead. For similar reasons, I'm also eliminating Ella much earlier since she's mostly a gimmick character. I will tone down her gimmick so she's more of a musical theater kid than a full-on Disney princess, but the most significant change to her character is that instead of being Sugar's perpetual victim, Ella won't even be aware of Sugar's hatred to begin with. I'm mainly doing this because Ella's desire to befriend Sugar, despite her friendship clearly being unwanted, was both illogical and a little pathetic, but more importantly, I wanted to flip their dynamic so that Sugar is the one getting steamrolled instead of Ella. In the real show, Sugar is completely secure in her own talent and merely lashes out at Ella for stepping on her territory, but in this rewrite, she'll actually recognize and be envious of Ella's superior grace and talent. She'll try over and over again to prove that she's better than Ella, only to get completely outclassed, kinda like Raquel from Barbie Life in the Dream House, until she eventually decides that the only way to win is to get rid of her. But I'll get into that later. For now, let's move on to Scarlet, who is extremely different from her canon counterpart as I've completely defanged her. She's not evil, she's not connected to Max, and as a result, she's not part of the island's meltdown either. There are many reasons for this that I'll get into later, but for the most part it's just because her villainy is way too over the top for what the show is, especially since it coincides with the equally absurd island reveal. It's just a lot to take in at once, and while I could have made her annoyance toward Max the catalyst for her spiral into villainy, there just isn't a graceful way to incorporate this change into my version of the story, so I didn't. She'll still be incredibly smart and retain her personality from the first few episodes, but outside of that, Scarlet will be a very utilitarian character that fills whatever role I need her to. As for Max, he'll be a more general nuisance since he's no longer attached to Scarlet, so his personality doesn't even have to change that much. The only difference is that instead of idolizing a Saturday morning cartoon brand of villainy, he'll try to be more of a morally dubious mastermind like, I don't know, Rick Sanchez. I mean, I guess he's also kind of a villain a lot of the time, but the point is that Max puts more focus on being a cunning manipulator than being an outright supervillain. It's a very subtle difference, but similar to Sean, it grounds his personality in something that a teen would actually aspire to be. And in essence, it kind of just means he'll be like Mal, except his ego and poor planning skills will be played for laughs this time.
He's constantly trying to do things that he thinks are duplicitous and clever, but everyone on both teams just sees all the way through him. He just kind of succeeds in making everyone hate him, and then gets really upset about it when he finds out.
But anyway, returning to Pahkitew's long list of useless male characters, we have just one more, and it's Dave! Hooray! To be honest, Dave is probably my least favorite total drama character, just in general. Aside from his train wreck of a relationship with Sky, I just find his judgmental attitude towards his teammates extremely hypocritical since he's often just as useless as they are, if not more. Maybe it just upsets me because I was also a judgmental Asian twink at 13, and I hate to see myself reflected in the other, but either way, he just comes off very condescending. It makes me wish he got eliminated earlier or was more useful, but since he's the designated straight man of his team, he can't go too early or else we'd be left with a bunch of idiots, and making him skilled in anything wouldn't really be true to his character. So instead of changing Dave's personality outright, I'm going to slow the pace of his story and rearrange the beats of his relationship with Sky so that he's hopefully less annoying. That means he'll develop his crush on Sky more gradually instead of falling for her in the first episode. Sky will be allowed to finish her sentence about having a boyfriend. Dave will be heartbroken rather than angry, and when Dave finds out that Sky doesn't actually have a boyfriend, he'll delusionally take that as a sign that he still has a chance with her. If that sounds confusing, don't worry, I'll get into it later. I'm saying that a lot right now. The important thing is that he won't become desperate until his very last episode.
Insecure, dependent, obsessed.
And since Sky isn't competing in the finale, he won't end the season in a murderous downward spiral. And that brings us all the way back to the beginning of the characters section with Sky. As I mentioned before, Sky won't participate in the finale because she didn't have any strong rivalries to begin with. The most physically capable players either left early or were too busy to interact with her. And since that's still kind of the case in this rewrite, it's probably best that she leaves closer to the season's midpoint. However, I still think it's worth leaning into Sky's competitive spirit, especially as a potential finalist for the next season, which is why I'm getting rid of her attraction to Dave. Now, despite how drastic this might seem on the surface, making Sky's relationship with Dave one-sided surprisingly doesn't change much about how they interact. Her feelings never got in the way of winning challenges, and the show never gave her a compelling reason to like Dave anyway, so she doesn't lose anything by focusing solely on the competition. She practically does that already.
Dave's a nice guy, and he is cute. But I have to keep my head in the game.
All that really changes is that she's no longer unsure about her feelings, which was one of the more frustrating parts of her character anyway, so I'd say it's a worthy trade-off. Other than that, she'll be mostly the same aside from being eliminated earlier. And lastly, since this was arguably Chris's most heartless season to date, I will try to pull him back to his characterization from, Revenge and All-Stars to show that he still has, some humanity left. I'm not gonna go full, Island Chris, because it's a big jump for him, so pulling him back a little bit seems more realistic. So he'll still be sadistic and unhinged, but he'll also interact with the contestants in person more often, his relationship with Topher won't deteriorate, and he'll treat Chef as more of an equal like in previous seasons. In fact, I'd like to give Chef a greater presence in general since he was weirdly absent from this season. However, I don't want either of them to get too involved with the contestants since Chris had a bad habit of personally meddling with the players' emotions. But with all that out of the way, we can finally get into the actual episodes. Episode 1. Compared to most of the other episodes, Episode 1 will be fairly close to the original, with only a few minor tweaks to illustrate the alterations I've made. For example, Chris will be on a TV monitor rather than a hologram for the sake of realism, and he won't explode the Zeppelin since that's both expensive and insane. Instead, Chef will just force the players out normally, with Jasmine and Rodney guiding the other contestants to the exits to show their leadership skills. Ella jumps willingly to live her world tour fantasies, while Dave is personally thrown off by Chef to highlight his cowardice. There will also be shady landing pads laid on the shore to show that Chris is at least making a token effort to be safe, and once all the teens make it to the beach, Chris instructs Chef to land the Zeppelin elsewhere. Chris proceeds to announce the teams, which are mostly the same except for Max and Beardo starting on opposite sides. However, just like the real episode, he also mispronounces Sammy's name, which prompts her to explain her conflict with Amy in the confessional. After introducing the contestants, Chris leads them to the location of their first challenge, and he explains that he spent a lot of money to make this island more high-tech and durable than the last one. He spared no expense, except on their housing, which is why their first challenge is to build some shelters. Like the real episode, this comes in 2 parts, with the first being the collection phase. However, in addition to collecting materials from junk piles guarded by Chef, there are also laser sensors surrounding each pile that alert him and show the high-tech nature of the island. Once the challenge begins, both teams start to strategize, and similar to the real episode, Jasmine and Rodney immediately butt heads over who should lead. Jasmine eventually lets Rodney speak, but he backs down once he looks Jasmine in the eye and realizes he has no idea how to talk to her. He goes on to mumble awkwardly to himself until Scarlett points out how the wheelbarrow would be a useful tool, which Sammy tries to simplify, but then Amy finishes her sentence and claims the idea as her own. The only difference is that she won't say, "My idea, mine," so she doesn't look desperate for approval. In any case, Jasmine agrees and tells Beardo to distract Chef so everyone else can load the wheelbarrow in secret. By contrast, the Confused Bears planning session is much shorter. Basically, everyone has their own ideas, which... There's so many S names in this goddamn series, I'm going to trip over my words so much. Basically, everyone has their own ideas, which Sky tries to form into a cohesive game plan, but Max gets impatient and rushes in with his own ingenious plan. He of course fails, and he ends up drawing Chef's fire to their side, so Sky just kind of ends up telling everyone to grab something in the chaos, which basically results in the Bears doing slapstick for the remainder of this phase. Sky, Sean, and Ella maneuver the field effortlessly enough, but Sugar, Dave, and Max are far less graceful and become Chef's main targets. Leonard is the only bear to avoid Chef altogether, but only because he stays behind to unsuccessfully summon materials to his side. Meanwhile, the floating salmon manage to bring in tons of material since Rodney is pushing the wheelbarrow, and Beardo's sound effects are a successful distraction from their activities. Topher does his best in hopes of getting Chris's attention instead of talking to him directly and grinding the episode's momentum to a halt, and Sammy even dodges some shots from Chef due to her athleticism, though Amy is quick to shut her back down. By the end of the collection phase, the salmon have amassed way more material than the bears, and their lead continues into the construction phase as Sammy comes up with the idea to build a treehouse, though the concept is once again stolen by Amy. Scarlett concurs that building above ground would be advantageous. Topher agrees so long as he gets the side of the cabin closest to Chris, and Rodney eagerly gets to work as Jasmine assigns their roles. The Confused Bears, on the other hand, struggle to come up with anything because Dave keeps shooting down everyone's ideas. In fairness, they don't have much to work with in the first place, but Dave's judgment and apprehension slow down the team considerably until Leonard comes up with the wizard tower, which gains a surprising amount of support. Ella thinks it's a genuinely good idea, Sugar agrees so she looks cooperative, Max thinks it would make for a cool team base, and Sean tepidly argues that the extra height could be beneficial. Dave is skeptical at first, but once Chris announces the time remaining, Sky insists that building something is better than building nothing, so he reluctantly agrees. And unfortunately for them, their tower collapses as it does in the real episode, and they lose. At elimination, the vote comes down to Max and Leonard, but since it was his idea that cost him the challenge and he did nothing in the first half, Leonard is ultimately the one that goes home. Overall, I'm glad this episode didn't require too many changes. Aside from the ones I made to the characters, I mostly just tried to show more attempts at planning. The reversal of Max and Beardo's teams was also a major departure, though its impact on this particular episode is pretty inconsequential. It mainly just serves to give Dave the most frustrating teammates possible and to put Rodney and Beardo in proximity to each other for their eventual friendship. Other than that, the only change that warrants deeper explanation is Chris's line about enhancing the island with technology, in this case with lasers. It's a very minor addition, but since Chris has already been upfront about dumping toxic waste and fracking on Camp Wawanakwa, it just kind of makes sense that he'd be open about building an artificial island, even if the full extent of it is still obscured. It helps that introducing this concept early prepares the audience for how far they'll need to suspend their disbelief later in the season. However, I also just felt it was necessary to incorporate the island's artificiality into the challenges so that the setting's potential didn't go to waste. Mind you, I'm not even a fan of the island being mechanical, but since it's still an integral part of at least one of the eliminations, as well as the finale, I thought I may as well make the most of it. Episode 2. Due to their lack of shelter, Episode 2 opens on the Confused Bears waking up after a relatively sleepless night. Sean volunteers to forage for food since they're all in desperate need of a good breakfast, and while he initially chooses to go with Ella since she's the only one who's not sleep-deprived, Sugar insists on going instead. Part of it is that she wants to show she's a better teammate, but she's also just hungry. Conversely, the girls on Team Salmon are much luckier as they get to sleep in, but the boys in the treehouse are wide awake as Rodney frets over his crush on Jasmine. Topher mostly tries to ignore him in favor of Chris, and Beardo is sort of just chilling there, but eventually Jasmine stops by to tell them that she's foraging too, and so Rodney volunteers to go with her. Unfortunately for Rodney, this turns out to be a pretty bad idea since he still doesn't know how to talk to her. Jasmine begins to worry that her intimidating stature will make every interaction on this island painfully awkward, but thankfully they run into Sean, who is perfect perfectly capable of holding a conversation with her. The way they meet is that he essentially saves Sugar from eating a manchineel fruit, much like Sammy in the real episode 2, and after briefly questioning what a manchineel tree is even doing in Canada, Jasmine proceeds to compliment Sean's survival knowledge. He explains that he was inspired to learn survival skills after watching so many horror movies where the characters die for dumb reasons, and as they go on to banter effortlessly, Rodney quietly observes their interaction with bitter jealousy. After that, Chris calls everyone in for the day's challenge, and we find that it's basically a combination of the Doom balloons from episode 3 and Capture the Flag. The Bears decide to go on the offensive and leave their weakest members, Dave and Max, to guard their flag. Meanwhile, Amy volunteers herself and Sammy to guard the Salmon's flag, which seems like initiative to her teammates, but in reality she just doesn't want to get her hands dirty. As each team heads toward the midpoint between the flags, we get a bit more characterization from each player. Sugar specifically shows signs of insecurity when Ella proves to be a much better singer than her, but once the Bears hear the Salmon approach, they hide. The Salmon, in turn, quiet down once they realize the Bears have gone silent, but it's all for nothing as Beardo and Rodney get hit with balloons before they even have a chance to throw theirs. Jasmine spots the assailants, Sky and Sean, and decides to chase after them before they reach her team's flag, but as she leaves, she orders Scarlet and Topher to continue running toward the Bears' flag without her. Scarlet does this by just following Sugar and Ella as they retreat, but Topher kind of just gets lost in the chaos and ends up in a completely different path. And so, while everyone is kind of running around for a bit, the story takes a brief detour to check in on Max, who has just finished laying traps around the flag so he can leave. Earlier in the episode, he saw a cave that would make for a perfect hideout, so he's been setting traps to guard the flag while he's gone. But when Dave discovers this, he protests because the traps are very poorly made and he doesn't want to face the Salmon alone. Unfortunately for him, Max just kind of doesn't care and leaves Dave to fend for himself. After that short intermission, the story returns to Topher, who continues to wander aimlessly until he stumbles onto Chris's location. Upon meeting his idol, Topher praises the game's difficulty, but he makes a crucial mistake when he gives Chris the idea to make the challenge even harder. Specifically, he suggests releasing a pack of ravenous carnivores onto the island, and, with Chris being Chris, he already has a shipping container full of them, which he delivers by drone. Some of the animals then chase Topher away, and they continue to cause trouble for the rest of the contestants throughout the episode. This is first shown through Sugar and Ella, who got lost after their encounter with the Salmon. As they walk together, Sugar tries to be civil, but once they run into some birds of prey and Ella tries to quell them by singing, Sugar can't help but try to upstage her.
Any notes you can sing, I can sing sweeter.
I can sing anything sweeter than you.
She's unsuccessful, obviously, but this musical sequence goes on for a while until Scarlet comes out of hiding to nail Sugar with a balloon. She then reaches for another one, hoping to pin Ella as well, but Ella commands the birds to pop her balloon before she can throw it, which results in Scarlet getting disqualified instead. Meanwhile, Sky and Sean get ready to ambush Jasmine, but when they're suddenly forced out of hiding by one of Chris's animals, she dodges their balloons and prepares to retaliate. This leads to a lengthy balloon fight as they try not to get eaten by said predator, but eventually all three of them get hit anyway, which means that it's up to Topher and Ella to capture their respective teams' flags. Luckily for Topher, he's been chased all the way to the Bears' flag. However, when he tries to take it, Dave tricks him into thinking Chris is right behind him and strikes him when his back is turned. And so that kind of just leaves Amy and Sammy as the only floating salmon that can capture the Bears' flag. And although Amy orders her sister to get it, Sammy refuses to go alone. So they end up fighting over who should get it until Ella distracts them with a horde of animals long enough to capture their flag. This means the Bears win, and as a bonus, when the team sees Max leaving his cave after the challenge, they commend him for finding a shelter, much to his dismay. By the time the salmon get to the elimination ceremony, it's pretty obvious that everyone is going to vote for Topher. He got lost, made the challenge harder, and failed to steal the flag when he had the chance, so of course he's getting eliminated in this episode. However, it's worth noting that Beardo also makes it to the bottom two for getting hit first, but that's not really important yet. What is important is how this episode allows the characters to interact more by switching out the relay race for the Doom Balloon Challenge. I'm still going to use the relay race in the next episode, but I wanted to switch them around because it felt crucial to establish certain relationships through dialogue, and the urgency of a race was not conducive to that goal. Specifically, I wanted to give Sugar and Ella more breathing room since they're the focus of the first major arc, but the slower pace also benefits some of the other characters as well. For Sugar and Ella, the seeds of their rivalry are planted through a singing competition that Sugar can't win, instead of making her just immediately hostile toward Ella for just being nice. Dave is abandoned by the most incompetent member of his team, which will make Sky's support in the next episode all the more impactful to him. And while the canon version of Sammy only decides to stand up for herself after Jasmine points out how terrible her situation is, this version of Sammy talks back to her sister without that input to show the audience that she isn't a total pushover. I mean, she auditioned for the show to get away from Amy, so I feel like it stands to reason that she already had some rebellious tendencies before meeting Jasmine. It also just makes more sense to save Jasmine's underdog speech for later, since it's literally only been one episode and they barely interacted yet. That being said, Jasmine herself is a lot lonelier in my version of episode 2, just because I wanted to show why her eventual friendship with Sammy is so important in the first place. In the real show, she just, instantly befriends Sammy despite mentioning how she struggles to make friends, and when Sammy is eliminated in a blast from the past, Jasmine isn't even particularly affected by it, but here we actually get to see how Jasmine's intimidating stature causes problems for her as she forages with Rodney. In this situation, Rodney's inability to communicate with Jasmine makes her feel isolated, and that perfectly illustrates why she would value people like Sammy and Sean who are able to talk to her without any weird hang-ups. This stands in contrast to Max, who wants nothing to do with his team and yet manages to find a shelter for them anyway. For the most part, this is just a remnant from the show where Max is the one who found the Confused Bears cave in episode 1, except now that he's a member of said team, I felt it would be appropriate to give him credit for the discovery instead of Sean.
Nice one, Sean! And great job finding this cave!
Besides, Sean found the cave off-screen, and Max never looked for an evil lair past episode 1 anyway, so combining these story beats into a storyline seemed like a more seamless way of introducing the Confused Bears' new home. It continues Max's streak of incompetence when it comes to executing his plans, and because Max wouldn't have been able to wander off on his own if this were still a race, it's yet another reason I had to change the challenge to something else. Otherwise, the Bears would have just been homeless for another episode. And now that we've covered the rest of the cast, it's finally time to address Topher and why I decided to eliminate him so much earlier. Part of me just wanted to give Topher a happier ending since his canon counterpart landed on a pretty sour note, but the main reason I dragged him so much lower is that his plan to replace Chris was extremely convoluted. This boy really thought he could just audition for the world's most popular reality show, steal Chris's phone, and convince the executives to drop him even after they kept him for 5 seasons and a prison sentence, all while explaining this plan to the camera crew managed by Chris. At that point, he may as well have just applied for the job directly. Even beyond the poor logistics of his plan, Topher's goals are just so narrow that they don't really give him any room to grow, so he was basically doomed to be disposable. I mean, first of all, there's just no way he'd replace the literal face of the franchise mid-season, but even if he had successfully overthrown Chris, which relationships would that affect? He never spent any time interacting with the other contestants due to his obsession with hosting, so none of their relationships would really be subverted by him suddenly being in charge. At most, he would be doing the same things Chris was doing, but without the brand recognition. He could give up on hosting altogether, but there isn't a logical next step for him to take after that, so his character would be pretty directionless if this happened. And while he could contribute to Chris's overall character development, it would leave a negligible impact on the show overall since Chris isn't directly involved in the player's drama, or at least he shouldn't be beyond initiating challenges. All of this could have been avoided if he had established relationships with the other contestants before getting eliminated, but doing so would diminish his primary gimmick of obsessing over Chris, which is why scaling down his ulterior motives ultimately felt like the best choice for his character. By drastically simplifying his motives, this change basically negates all of the issues I have with Topher, and in addition to removing the logistical nightmare that is his plan, turning Topher into a straightforward fanboy makes it much easier to bring his character to a satisfying conclusion. So that's basically it for all the important character changes, but there is one more minor thing I want to cover before moving on. In this episode, I specifically pointed out that Ella gets a full-length musical number with Sugar, and I wanted to make that distinction because she didn't really have any full songs in the real show until her elimination. I imagine the writers kept them short because it'd be kind of weird to let a single character hog the spotlight once per episode, but if she was never going to sing about anything substantial, and half the time she wasn't even allowed to sing because everyone wanted her to shut up, then what was even the point of making her a musical character in the first place? At that point, she's basically just an embodiment of that attitude where musicals are just people randomly bursting into song. That's why for this rewrite, I only want Ella to sing when it contributes to the story. In this case, it literally helps her win while also sparking her rivalry with Sugar, but all her shorter jingles should kind of just get cut out. Keep in mind she can still hum and do vocal exercises and stuff, I just don't want her to waste dialogue on a 5-second song about how she's actually wearing a blouse. Episode 3. Since Rodney is still sore from yesterday's challenge, episode 3 starts with Jasmine asking her female teammates if one of them can forage in Rodney's place. As expected, Amy offers Sammy's labor just as she did in I Love You Grease Pig, but instead of randomly calling her lazy, Amy justifies her command by saying Sammy owes it to the rest of the team, essentially pinning all the blame on her for not getting the flag when she told her to. Sammy prepares a rebuttal, but Amy returns to bed before she can say anything, so she begrudgingly goes with Jasmine. As they forage, Sammy is clearly upset, but she lightens up once Jasmine validates her feelings by acknowledging that Amy is kind of a jerk. Eventually, the pair run into Sean, who has brought Ella this time since he didn't want to babysit Sugar again, and just like the previous episode, Sean and Jasmine end up chatting until they have to leave. This time they talk about their shared love of horror movies, and with Ella being a romantic, she comments on their chemistry in the confessional. Once challenge time rolls around, the cameras follow the contestants as they proceed to the meeting area. As they walk over, the players have several moments that reinforce their personalities and relationships. However, the most important interactions will be between Dave and the rest of his team. Specifically, Max and Sugar spend the whole trip annoying Dave with their stupidity until Sky steps in to make sure they don't get into a fight right before the challenge. Once the teams arrive, Chris reveals that the challenge is basically the relay race like I mentioned before. The only noteworthy differences are that each team will be passing along vulnerable baby piglets instead of adult hogs, and the final leg of the race will incorporate elements from 3 Zones and a Baby. Other sections of the race will also be different from episode 2, but I'll only cover the details when they're relevant. The challenge starts with Sean and Rodney going head-to-head. Sean is very quick, but Rodney is able to keep up with him through sheer jealousy. Both parties pass their piglets to the next contestant simultaneously, but while Scarlett is able to lure her baton with a pecan trail like in the real episode, Sugar ironically proves to be a pretty bad pig handler despite her country upbringing. This allows the salmon to take the lead as Scarlett passes the pig to Amy, and though Max tries to slow her down with yet another ingenious contraption, he inadvertently propels Amy all the way to the next part of the race. So, if he somehow got his hands on, a miniature rocket, for example, from the island's junk pile, it would push her forward to Sammy instead of backward like he planned. The salmon's increasing lead causes Sugar to give up on luring the pig, so she just ends up carrying it to Max. But while the bears catch up, Sammy struggles to get through her leg of the race because Amy keeps nitpicking her mistakes and calling her slow. It's extremely distracting, but when Jasmine starts encouraging her from the other side, Sammy is able to make it through and hand the pig to her. At the same time, Sugar finally manages to pass her pig to Max, and since his scheme against Amy made her go faster, he decides to use the same method to speed through his leg of the race. Conveniently, this does actually work, though with much more slapsticky results than Amy. Once he reaches the other side of his obstacle, Max hands the pig to Ella, and she breezes through her leg of the race through song, which of course makes Sugar even more envious than before. In any case, Ella is eventually able to pass the pig to Dave, and with that, she finally closes the gap between the bears and the salmon. This may seem weird since Jasmine had a massive lead, but since Dave and Jasmine's leg of the race requires them to move through a tight space, she ends up moving through the obstacle quite slowly. It could simply be because she's just really big, or it can be due to her claustrophobia, but in either case, Sammy eventually steps in to help her. Whether it's just through verbal encouragement or something more tangible isn't that important. What matters is that she reciprocates Jasmine's supportiveness so she can get the pig to the final obstacle. Meanwhile, Dave hesitates to even touch his team's pig out of pure disgust until something causes it to run and drag him through the mud. He manages to get to the other side, but he freaks out over being covered in grime until Sky calms him down like in the real episode 2. This moment stirs romantic feelings in Dave, which he expresses in the confessional, but that's not really important to Sky, who just takes the pig and runs to Beardo. Since the last leg of the race combines the first 2 zones from 3 Zones and a Baby, Sky and Beardo must carry their piglets through a gauntlet of their natural predators while narrowly avoiding a bunch of booby traps that could wake them up. At first, the pair move quietly toward the finish line, but unfortunately Beardo activates one of the traps and draws the predator's attention, which allows Sky to win the challenge. Lucky for Beardo, this turns out to be a non-elimination episode, but it's hard to be optimistic when his whole team blames him for their second loss. Overall, there's nothing too remarkable to report about this episode. The challenge concept is played pretty straight, so there isn't much to cover aside from small developments in Jasmine and Dave's relationships. In Jasmine's case, she shows growth in her relationships with both Sean and Sammy. For Sean, I just gave them a shared interest in horror since they didn't have much in common in the show besides wilderness survival and zombies. However, in Sammy's case, I wanted to slow things down since their friendship in the show always felt kind of rushed. Jasmine went from not knowing Sammy to calling her an underdog in under 3 minutes, whereas here she merely acknowledges Amy's mean personality while being oblivious to the full extent of her cruelty. It helps that Sammy is also equally supportive of Jasmine when she has trouble, so while it's generally a step down from where their friendship was in the real episode 3, it creates a much more believable progression from casual mutual support to ride or die best friends. Similarly, while Dave showed signs of liking Sky as early as episode 1, this episode is really the first time in this rewrite that he has any romantic feelings for her whatsoever. Again, it's really only an episode of difference, but like Sammy and Jasmine's friendship, it felt more organic to establish Dave's crush after putting him through 2 episodes of his team's bullshit. Episode 4. Unlike the last 2 episodes, episode 4 immediately starts with Jasmine and Sammy chatting as they forge together. Both of them are happy to have finally found a friend, and Sammy thanks Jasmine for helping her through the challenge. Jasmine reciprocates, however, when she refers to Sammy as Sammy, her new friend quickly corrects her pronunciation, though she's a bit sheepish when doing so. Jasmine is slightly confused by Sammy's embarrassment, but after briefly recounting the horrible story of how Amy came up with the nickname, Jasmine immediately corrects herself, which Sammy appreciates immensely. Eventually, the girls run into Sean, who brought Max with him this time, and as usual, they start chatting with each other. The conversation starts pretty normal, but Sean mentions that he had a hard time sleeping due to hearing some weird noises last night, which Max dismisses as crazy before heading off to the challenge. Once all the contestants have convened, Chris announces that today's challenge is a 3-part talent show inspired by the one from Packed with Talent. For the Bears, Sky volunteers to do a rhythmic gymnastics routine while Ella offers to sing. Max and Sugar also nominate themselves, but Sugar is ultimately chosen due to her pageant background. Meanwhile, Beardo volunteers to perform for the salmon, but he's promptly shut down for screwing up the previous challenge. Instead, Scarlett decides that their best chance at winning is to have a diverse and impressive lineup, so she picks Rodney to demonstrate his strength, Sammy to do a cheer routine, and Jasmine to show off more of her animal taming skills from the previous episode. Amy insists on joining Sammy's routine since she believes that her sister would fail without her, and everyone else just decides to work behind the scenes. Beardo is disappointed that his team doesn't trust him, but as the only other guy on his team, Rodney does make an effort to cheer him up a bit, and it kinda works. But anyway, as the Bears set up, Sugar asks Dave where she is on the set list so she can have time to practice, but when Dave tells her that it's her, Sky, and then Ella so that they can save the best for last, Sugar is furious. Ella tries to calm her down, but she phrases things in a way that sounds like pageant talk, which makes Sugar even angrier. She then tries to attack Ella but is unsuccessful, so she storms off and Sky goes to look for her. In the meantime, while the salmon prepare their half of the show, Rodney goes backstage to talk to Scarlett about his performance, but instead bumps into Jasmine. When he sees the animal she caught for her routine, he tries to talk to her about it, but as usual, it only serves as setup for Sean to talk to her instead. Beardo eventually comes along to ask Rodney how his practice is going, and as Sean and Jasmine take their conversation off screen, Rodney vents to Beardo about his inability to express his feelings to Jasmine. He wishes he could talk to her directly, so Beardo suggests writing his thoughts down before talking to her, but Rodney takes this a step further and decides to confess his feelings through poetry in place of his weightlifting routine. If you're wondering why he chooses poetry specifically, it's because he was surprisingly articulate in the show, and this side of him only seemed to be hampered by his inability to talk to his crushes, so I thought it'd be kind of interesting to put this in here. As showtime approaches, Sky eventually manages to find Sugar, and she successfully convinces her to come back so they can finish rehearsals, though she does return reluctantly. Sky hands Sugar off to the stage crew so she can get ready, but while Ella is practicing on stage, Sugar lets the intrusive thoughts win and decides to incapacitate her with sandbags. Fortunately, Ella is able to avoid Sugar's assault long enough for Dave to notice and request backup from Sean, but while Dave attempts to hold Sugar back, Sean gets hit trying to save Ella. When the salmon rush out to see what's causing all the commotion, Jasmine immediately runs over to Sean once she realizes he's hurt and volunteers to look after him until it's her turn to perform. Everyone is cool with this since she's performing last anyway, but it breaks Rodney's heart to realize that Jasmine will never love him as much as she loves Sean. Meanwhile, Sky berates Sugar for potentially hurting their best player, and replaces her performance with Max's until she apologizes to Ella. Sugar is obviously unhappy with this arrangement, but as she complains in the confessional about how Ella always takes what she has, Sugar comes up with one more scheme to get rid of her. For now, though, let's move on to the actual talent show, since Sugar needs a minute to put her plan together. Between Max and Rodney, round 1 is a no-brainer. Max's performance just kinda sucks, but Rodney's poetry reading is enhanced by the deep sadness he feels when looking at Sean and Jasmine in the audience. So round 1 just kinda goes to the salmon. Round 2 is between Sky and the twins, but this one is a bit more interesting. Sky's routine is flawless, so she gets a perfect score. Dave is especially mesmerized by it. However, while Amy and Sammy start off well, Amy starts bossing Sammy around and causes them to mess up. They still get a high score, but it's lower than Sky's, so Amy belittles Sammy backstage until Jasmine steps in to defend her. Shortly after this, Sugar returns from her absence and publicly apologizes to Ella for attacking her earlier. Everyone backstage is somewhat skeptical of her authenticity given how crazy she's been acting, but in addition to her apology, Sugar brings a peace offering, a simple apple, which Ella graciously accepts and eats before walking on stage. Sky praises Sugar for swallowing her pride and apologizing, but when she notices a rash on Sugar's hand, she quickly covers it up. Ella then proceeds to sing her song, but after choking and coughing so much that she scares away Jasmine's animal, she has to be taken away for medical treatment and each team is forced to find new talent. The Bears basically have to choose Sugar since Dave has no talent and Sean is still recovering, but the Salmon have a much harder time deciding who should perform. Jasmine's other talents aren't really conducive to a performance, and Scarlett's lack of stage presence isn't exactly ideal, and so eventually Rodney advocates for Beardo to go since they've been talking all day and he volunteered himself earlier. Once Sugar and Beardo are ready, both acts take the stage simultaneously since Ella's little mishap ate a huge chunk of the runtime. Sugar starts the final round with a decent song, but Beardo completely blows her out of the water with his own vocal talents. The The most obvious choice would be beatboxing, but if that feels too derivative of Harold, it would also be funny if he was an opera singer, or just took one of Sky or Sean's talents from Packed with Talent. If I had to choose, I'd rather give him Sky's belching powers, but regardless of what his talent is, he wins the challenge for the salmon and they celebrate him. Conversely, the Bears have a tough time deciding who to eliminate since a lot of people screwed up today. Max's performance completely bombed and Sugar has been acting aggressive all day, but since she ultimately apologized in front of everyone, the vote comes down to Sean and Ella over health concerns. Sean is still reeling from his head injury, but since Ella's main asset was her voice, which won't come back for several weeks, the Bears reluctantly choose to eliminate her instead. I'll admit that punishing Ella this severely isn't very fair, but since Sugar is leaving in the next episode, I basically had to get her out now since Sugar is the only character that hates Ella enough to get her off the show. It's not like she had any significant relationships besides Sugar anyway, so nothing is really lost if she gets eliminated now. As for why I chose to eliminate her with the Manchineel fruit, I mostly did it because it felt more clever than using Chris's no singing policy. Similar to Mal's reset button, Chris's singing ban is just so easy to exploit that it removes a lot of the strategy that would have made Ella's elimination interesting, whereas here, Sugar actually has to be creative with how she gets rid of her biggest rival. The Manchineel plot also just fits Sugar and Ella way better because it mirrors the story of Snow White, and it's genuinely baffling to me that the writers didn't see that. The other reason I wanted to hand the Manchineel plot over to Sugar is that Sammy just didn't make very good use of it. This may sound weird because the Manchineel fruit is what allowed her to escape Amy's abuse in the first place, but practically speaking, we never actually learned anything new about Sammy as a result of her sister's departure. She didn't develop her friendship with Jasmine, her team continued to verbally abuse her in Amy's place, and the only noteworthy things she said before getting eliminated were how she hates Amy, which we already knew. It's not like Sammy isn't a sympathetic character, and I don't want to say that the story of an abused girl gaining independence and working on herself is boring, but I am saying that the writers seemed completely disinterested in telling that story. It all just felt like a bunch of wasted potential. However, even if Sammy had been given more screen time, I doubt she'd be able to grow much due to the switcheroo essentially preventing her from doing so. And I don't mean that in like a moralistic way. Even if poisoning and impersonating her sister sounds like something straight out of a Lifetime movie, if that's what she needs to heal, then I for one support her journey. But what I mean is that because Sammy must pretend to be Amy, she quite literally isn't allowed to be herself, and that makes it really difficult to develop her character. At least when Mal took over Mike's body, it was indicative of his deceptive nature, and there were characters that cared whether or not Mike came back. But with Sammy, stealing her sister's identity isn't a reflection of her overall character, and nobody knows or cares about either twin to feel shocked or betrayed when the truth is revealed. Instead, Sammy is stuck with constant reminders of her sister, except it's arguably worse this time, because she can't even speak up about it without risking elimination. That's why I felt it was so important to develop Sammy without this weird switcheroo, because allowing Sammy to be herself means she can grow at a more reasonable pace, and that's especially apparent when it comes to her friendship with Jasmine. Like, at this point in the real show, they were already besties, but I imagine it's much more satisfying to watch Jasmine defend Sammy after gradually uncovering Amy's cruelty, as opposed to her supporting Sammy from the jump. That being said, I also just wanted to slip in that conversation about the pronunciation of Sammy's name because it always bugged me that Jasmine continued to mispronounce it even after they became friends. Personally, I don't even care about pronouncing Sammy's name correctly. I only changed it from Sammy to Sammy in this script because I kept mixing her up with Amy whenever they were in the same sentence. But even then, I felt like it was a missed opportunity to show that Jasmine respects Sammy's identity. But anyway, with all that in mind, I'd like to finally move on to the second friendship introduced in this episode and discuss the deeper reasons I decided to make Beardo and Rodney friends. Though I initially characterized their relationship merely as a way to give Rodney someone to talk to, there are actually a few tenuous connections that make their friendship somewhat plausible given the circumstances. Their biggest similarity is that they're the only guys left on the floating salmon, and since Rodney grew up leading an all-male household, it seemed reasonable to me that Rodney would kind of reach out to Beardo as some kind of older brother figure at some point. It helps that both of them also have trouble talking to other people, but I think the fact that their camaraderie is what allows Beardo to redeem himself in the eyes of his team is what really solidifies their relationship. It at least gives them a more solid basis for their friendship than, say, Dave and Sean, who only seem to talk to each other because no one else was available to discuss their girl problems. But either way, I view Beardo and Rodney's friendship as a net positive for this season, specifically because there basically weren't any friendships in the real show besides Jasmine and Sammy's, and it's not like that one was really happening for most of the season. Lastly, before I wrap up this debrief, I'd like to go on record and say that the real episode 4 actually wasn't that bad. I don't know why, it's probably because no one was that deep into their character arcs yet, so the characters were significantly less annoying. But also, it was the most consistently funny episode of the season, though keep in mind I only laughed at like 4 jokes.
Oh no, my finger! Yours are too dang big!
I undid mine easily enough.
For a point, you must kiss a person next to you. Okay, Sugar, to get a point, you must take this live tarantula and... Whoa, whoa! Ugh. All you had to do was pet it!
Oh, does this count?
Yeah, close enough.
Honestly, it's a little embarrassing how low the bar is for me to consider this episode good, but at this point I'll take what I can get. Episode 5. Since Sean's head still hurts from the previous episode, Sky volunteers to forage for the bears in his place. Dave offers to join so he can spend more time with her, but Sky worries that leaving Sean alone with Max will exacerbate his headache. He's been complaining about his performance nonstop since yesterday, but luckily Sugar is still pumped from her personal victory over Ella, so she happily volunteers to occupy Max, which the rest of the team appreciates. Meanwhile, at the Salmon's treehouse, Rodney sulks over Jasmine for not liking him, which Beardo responds to with optimism. He's hyped that he's back in his team's good graces, so he reassures Rodney that his love life can only be uphill from here, as it cuts to Amy and Sammy arguing with each other. Sammy is preparing to forage, like she's weaving a basket or something, and Amy criticizes her at every step until Sammy finally snaps back at her with Jasmine's support. As they leave, Amy tries to get sympathy from Scarlet, but she's shocked to hear that even Scarlet is starting to agree with her inferior sister. After that, the show cuts back to Dave and Sky, and as they forage, Sky laments over their recent loss. Dave doesn't really pay attention to what she's saying since he's mostly just thinking about how to ask her out, but when she mentions how grateful she is for Sugar's help, Dave realizes that he should become the person she relies on instead. Jasmine and Sammy then come along, and when Sky sees their full baskets, she realizes that she and Dave haven't actually picked any food, so Dave makes himself useful and charges ahead to find some. While he's away, Jasmine asks how Sean is, and when Sky says that he's still recovering, Jasmine gets worried. Sammy reassures Jasmine that he'll be okay, but this intimate moment is rudely interrupted as Dave quickly returns in a panic with a rash on his hand. He explains that he was just trying to pick some apples, and Jasmine immediately recognizes the rash as a symptom of touching manchineel fruit. She proceeds to tell him and Sky what it is and how to get rid of the rash, but right when she's about to mention Sugar's earlier manchineel mishap from episode 2, Chris interrupts them and says it's challenge time. For this episode, the challenge is a hedge maze. There are multiple zones within it which the players must traverse, but the one at the heart of the maze contains a GPS that can be used to clear the rest of the challenge. However, there's only one, so the team that doesn't get it is basically screwed. Sean asks if he can be exempted from the challenge due to his head injury, but Chris doesn't want anyone skipping out on this, so he calls Chef. When Chef arrives, he gives Sean a disgusting home remedy to make him feel better, and although it works, Sean doubts that it actually did anything good. Regardless, the teams are ushered into the maze, and the entrance is blocked by a metal door. As both teams talk, Jasmine and Sean catch up. Their conversation starts off casual, but it eventually goes towards strategy, and they both decide to use the left-hand rule, which is apparently supposed to guarantee your exit from a maze. Though Rodney has already given up on pursuing Jasmine, he's still hurt to see her talk to Sean, so Scarlet offers him some food to comfort him. When the teams arrive at the first fork in the road, they part ways. Once the bears enter their first zone, they immediately struggle to get through it. For the sake of an example, let's just say it's a swamp or something and they can't get past the smell without bailing. Everyone racks their brains to figure out how to pass the swamp until Sugar teaches them a technique from the countryside that allows them to pass more easily, and the team praises her ingenuity. Meanwhile, Scarlet lags behind on the salmon's first zone and gets caught on something. Rodney helps her out, and she begins to consider him a possible ally. Back to the bears. As they travel to the next zone, Sean's teammates explain to him what happened to Ella while he was unconscious. Sugar gets nervous as Sean begins to recognize the manchineel symptoms present in Ella's story, but before he can finish his thought, the bears find themselves back in Zone 1 and are left confused. By contrast, the salmon are already in Zone 2, and Scarlet has a plan to get through the obstacle. Amy almost screws up the plan, but Rodney and Sammy manage to save it and garner praise from the rest of their team. This upsets Amy, since it means even more people are lauding Sammy, but for Rodney it kickstarts his love for Scarlet as she specifically compliments him for coming in clutch. As the salmon move forward, the bears debate over how to leave Zone 1 after circling back to it maybe like 1 or 2 times. Out of frustration, Max says they should just rush through the maze so they can find the exit faster, but Sean wants to try the left-hand rule one more time before they resort to that, and Sky agrees with him. They decide to leave as soon as Sky calms down Dave, who has been panicking over being lost. However, while she's doing that, Sugar encourages Max to do his plan anyway, and then alerts Sean to chase after him in hopes that they'll lose and she can vote him off. And so, Sky returns with Dave, and when she sees that both Max and Sean are missing, they join Sugar to go and find them. In the meantime, the salmon eventually reach the heart of the maze, and Sammy suggests looking for the GPS. Amy says they're far enough in the lead for it not to matter, but when Sugar's group runs in, the salmon once again side with Sammy. Likewise, Sugar convinces her team to look for the GPS too, in an effort to keep them away from Sean for as long as possible. Sean himself struggles to find his way around the maze despite backtracking constantly, and he begins to worry that Chef's remedy has messed up his sense of direction. He even starts to get a little paranoid as he feels like someone is following him, but it turns out to be Max who inexplicably comes out of a dead end. Sean chastises Max for running off, but when Max explains that Sugar put him up to it, they're confused as to why Sugar would trick them like this. Back at the heart of the maze, Sammy eventually spots the GPS, but it's in a really high place that requires teamwork to get it. Sammy guides the salmon into forming a pyramid so she can reach it, but Amy ruins their form just to spite her. When the GPS lands right in front of the bears and they take it, Amy proceeds to blame Sammy. However, because Sammy caught a good view of the exit from the top of the pyramid, she's fortunately able to lead her teammates to the end of the maze, though only after Scarlet saves Rodney from falling and his crush on her is solidified. As the salmon zero in on the exit, Sugar becomes increasingly desperate to leave the maze so she can avoid confronting Sean. However, both halves of their team eventually run right into each other, destroying the GPS in the process. Sugar tries to escape the group, but when Sean and Max ask why she tricked them into running after each other, Sky is angered to learn that Sugar has been deceiving the team and demands the truth. Sugar tries to cover up her lies, but in the end she accidentally admits to poisoning Ella right as Chris announces the salmon's win. The bears are disappointed in Sugar, and obviously vote her off for poisoning Ella and lying to them. However, before the episode ends, Sean asks Chef when his medicine was supposed to wear off, to which he responds that it wore off hours ago. This unnerves Sean, as that means the maze's layout really was shifting and it wasn't just a hallucination. This is pretty much the entire reason I made the challenge a maze in the first place. A race through the forest may have been just as disorienting, but a maze only has one correct path. Up until this point, the bears had just assumed they were getting lost due to Sean's unreliable mental state, but now that Sean knows his sense of direction was correct and not the result of head trauma or experimental medicine, he's aware that something suspicious is going on with the challenges. He just isn't sure what. The only hint he has is the metal door that blocked the entrance, but since it's a hedge maze, there's no reason for anyone to suspect that this technology applies to the rest of the maze as well. Still, Sean can't help but develop a sense of paranoid skepticism about these strange occurrences, and hopefully this sentiment will raise the audience's suspicion in anticipation of the island twist. Besides that, I also just wanted to take a short break from Sean and Jasmine's usual banter to set up Sky and Dave's relationship instead. They still sneak in a short conversation before the challenge begins, but other relationships really take center stage in this episode, including Scarlet and Rodney's. Likewise, although Jasmine's support has been integral in Sammy becoming a more confident, secure, and useful person overall, the friendship itself takes a back seat in this episode to focus more on Sammy's individual growth as a result of their bond. She's able to take charge and contribute to challenges, but arguably the most important aspect of Sammy's development is how it affects Amy. For the most part, Amy's sabotage of Sammy is a sign of things to come, but on the other hand, it also marks a turning point where Sammy has finally grown enough that it threatens Amy's sense of superiority. This is in direct contrast to Sugar, who has essentially taken Amy's place as the bully who gets eliminated early. I mean, the overall reason I dragged her down was just because she wasn't an effective main antagonist. However, I also did it because none of her non-Ella relationships were that compelling, so it just made sense to eliminate them back to back. It helps that the bears actually care about Ella in this rewrite, so they're way more willing to hold Sugar accountable for her actions, but also because her elimination was so underwhelming in the show, I wanted to make her somewhat useful in the first half of the episode to add some tragedy to her story. Essentially, I wanted to give her a taste of the adoration she's so desperately been craving, just so I could rip it away from her as punishment for poisoning Ella. Maybe it's a bit cruel, but for an antagonist as unthreatening and buffoonish as Sugar, it seemed way more appropriate than letting her conveniently stumble her way to the semifinals. That being said, I will go on record once again to say that Sugar actually had some of the funniest jokes throughout the season. To be clear, that doesn't mean Sugar herself was a very funny character. In fact, the vast majority of her jokes relied on basic toilet humor or uncreative use of her stupidity that I didn't find funny at all. But like episode 4, I enjoyed the timing of a few very specific jokes from her.
Ella, what happened? Are you okay?
I'm fine. It's just that my heart is filled with sorrow. That was about something else.
Will this be the end of Sugar's short life? Saying I hope so seems wrong.
Ew! Don't do that!
Hold still, Betty! You're only making it worse!
Oh my! Please stop!
Smell what you missed, sucker!
so Sugar is mostly just the funniest character by default. Hopefully that gives you a sense of how often I laughed during this season. Episode 6. Episode 6 continues where episode 5 left off as the salmon return to their treehouse after a long dinner. It's nighttime and several of Sammy's teammates compliment her for coming in clutch throughout the challenge until Amy has an outburst belittling her sister's accomplishments. She does everything in her power to put Sammy back in her place, but she leaves in frustration when Sammy refuses to back down. Likewise, as the bears return to their cave, Dave and Max argue over who should take responsibility for the team's failure. Dave calls Max stupid for running off, while Max criticizes Dave for panicking the whole time, until Sky eventually breaks them up and just tells them to go to sleep. She says getting some rest will help them do better tomorrow, and Sean agrees, hoping to sleep off the anxious feeling he got from the last episode. After a while, both teams manage to fall asleep until Chris wakes them back up to compete in a nighttime challenge. For the first half, the players must find a special idol that corresponds to their team, and for the second half, they need to navigate a crystal cavern so they can place the idol on a pedestal on the other side of the island. The contestants get kind of suspicious of this challenge's ritualistic elements, but Chris explains that, according to legend, the idols were made to quell the rage of some monster that's rumored to roam the island at night. He says it like that, as if it's a rumor, but obviously it's going to come up later in the episode, just like every nighttime challenge with a mysterious assailant. The contestants have until sunrise to finish the challenge, and since the salmon won yesterday, they get flashlights. Once the challenge begins, both teams partner up in order to cover more ground. I mean, for the Bears, it's also because Sean thinks it's a bad idea to split up a group of teenagers at night, so Sky pairs up with Dave after he begs to join her while Sean goes with Max. As for the salmon, Jasmine and Sammy immediately choose each other, while the rest of their team sorts themselves out. Scarlett initially reaches out to Rodney, but when he's too flustered to respond to her offer, she goes with Amy instead, which leaves Rodney and Beardo as the last couple. The teams disperse, and the next few scenes are basically just one-on-one conversations between each pair, which hopefully won't be too confusing. For Sky and Dave, they basically have the same conversation from a blast from the past. Sky talks about her life, Dave doesn't listen, he accidentally insults her, and then he confesses his feelings. Sky tries to turn him down gently, but instead of stopping at, "I like you too, but," Sky will be allowed to finish and say, "But I have a boyfriend." She doesn't actually have a boyfriend, she's only saying it to spare Dave's feelings, but Dave pretends to take it well until he reveals in a confessional that he's absolutely devastated. Similarly, Rodney expresses his own frustration to Beardo about his inability to connect with Scarlett. He's tired of being too nervous to speak to his crushes, so Beardo teaches him a trick to stay calm when talking to girls. Weirdly enough, this actually works, but since neither of them are relevant to the rest of the plot, they get captured by the monster who was attracted to their loud conversation. In the meantime, as Max and Sean search for their own idol, Max mutters to himself about Dave insulting his intelligence earlier in the episode. He's frustrated that people don't see him as the clever mastermind he wants to be, and after Sugar pulled such a masterful act of deceit despite her stupidity, Max is desperate to prove his intellect. Sean isn't very interested in his ramblings, but when he hears something approaching in his hypervigilant state, Sean tells Max to be quiet. He gets very apprehensive, but it turns out to just be Jasmine and Sammy. Sean is relieved and strikes up a conversation with Jasmine about the movie they discussed in episode 3, since they didn't talk much in the last episode. However, he eventually notices how the monster from the movie is a lot like the one Chris described for this challenge, which kind of spooks Jasmine. She doesn't dwell on it too long though, and before they part ways, she lends Sean her flashlight out of fairness. Max is skeptical about accepting help from the opposite team, but Sean says they can trust them. Moving right along, Amy has been ranting to Scarlett about her sister this whole time. She's frustrated that everyone is suddenly taking Sammy's side and ignoring her needs, but the way she phrases it leads Scarlett to think that Amy is the victim in their relationship. When Scarlett points this out, Amy sees this as an opportunity to twist things back in her favor, so she plays into this narrative by painting Sammy as an abusive liar, and then asking for Scarlett's support. Back to Sky and Dave, Dave dejectedly continues his search for the idol. Sky notices his negative attitude and tries to check in on him, but this only results in another awkward interaction. Dave bangs his head against a nearby tree out of embarrassment, and conveniently, the bear's idol falls right out of it. He calls Sky over to report his discovery, and they leave to regroup with Sean and Max. Max himself gets excited when he finds something that appears to be the bear's idol, but he's annoyed when he realizes it's just a similar-looking rock. Sean tries to calm him down, saying that it's difficult to find on purpose, only to conveniently stumble upon the salmon's idol for them. Max thinks they should keep the idol so the salmon automatically lose, but Sean decides to give it to Jasmine and Sammy out of fairness for borrowing their flashlight. This disappoints Max even further, but as Sean hands off the idol to Jasmine, Max lands on a secret switch that causes the ground beneath Jasmine and Sean to collapse. They're okay, but the hole they've found themselves in is too deep to climb out of. Jasmine begins to panic due to her claustrophobia, but luckily, or unluckily depending on how you see it, Sean spots a crystal passage inside the sinkhole and infers that it must be connected to the cave system Chris talked about. By extension, that means there must also be an exit somewhere, so he tells Max and Sammy to meet them on the other side of the island, as he and Jasmine reluctantly enter the cave. However, unbeknownst to Sammy, Max used this chaos as an opportunity to take the salmon's idol away from her and replace it with the aforementioned rock as a decoy. So with both idols found, Max and Sammy both meet up with their respective teams. Dave and Sky announce that they found the bear's idol, and Max explains what happens to Sean, and they all leave. Likewise, Sammy explains what happened to Jasmine, which prompts Amy to suggest that they leave immediately. Sammy is hesitant since Beardo and Rodney haven't arrived yet, but at Amy's request, Scarlet convinces Sammy that leaving right now is the right choice, so they end up going. Back in the cave, Sean continues to speculate about the monster as he and Jasmine walk through the cavern. He pauses when he hears some heavy breathing, fearing that it's the monster, only to realize that it's actually Jasmine hyperventilating due to her claustrophobia. Sean lets her talk so she can take her mind off the cave, and once she calms down, they keep going. However, before moving on, Sean steps on a mysterious substance that's characteristic of the monster, and realizes that he needs to get Jasmine out of the cave as soon as possible. Eventually, both teams reach the cave entrance, but it turns out that there are actually multiple entrances that they need to choose from. Chris hands flashlights to the bears once they decide on a cave, but Amy insists on holding the idol before the salmon go in. She says it's for safekeeping, but she really just wants to take credit for winning the challenge in case they get to the pedestal first. Sammy hesitates once more, but again, Scarlet argues in Amy's favor, leaving Sammy confused at the sudden shift in her team's loyalty. What follows is a quick rundown of how a few more players get picked off by the monster. Again, I'm hoping it won't be too confusing, but I wanted to alternate between the two teams' perspectives so they don't just get captured all at once. So, as the confused bears navigate their chosen cave, it's not long before they walk into a den of actual bears. The team tries to tiptoe around them, but the bears wake up and chase after Dave and Max as Sky is captured by the monster. Meanwhile, the salmon come across an underground river, and somehow Scarlet deduces that the exit is on the other side. Sammy tries to figure out a way to traverse it, but she ends up squabbling with Amy instead until they trip into the stream together. Scarlet calls out to them as they're swept up by the current, but she gets caught by the monster as well. The story then cuts back to Dave and Max once they're safe, but once Dave realizes that Sky is missing, he decides to go back for her. He hands the idol to Max and tells him to stay put, but Max chooses to finish the game without him as Dave is captured soon after, just like everyone else. The monster's kidnapping spree eventually slows down once we get back to Jasmine and Sean, though. Their flashlight is currently dying, and Sean worries that they won't make it out as he finds more evidence of the monster's existence. However, once Jasmine spots hints that an exit is nearby, Sean follows her as she eagerly rushes to find it. In the meantime, the twins eventually land in a pool of water next to another passage, and even in such dire circumstances, they continue to argue. Basically, Sammy wants to go back and save Scarlet, but Amy wants to press on and finish the challenge. Sammy quickly gets fed up and tries to storm off, but before she can leave, Amy threatens to tell Scarlet that Sammy abandoned her on purpose. Sammy questions why Scarlet would believe something so ridiculous, until it settles in that Amy has been spreading lies about her all night. She wants to argue more, but when she hears Jasmine and Sean scream from the nearby passage, she and Amy run toward it. As they enter the final chamber of the cave, they're horrified to see all the missing contestants stuck to the walls as Jasmine and Sean are cornered by the monster. Max comes in soon after and is shocked to see the monster too, but no one really pays attention to his reaction. In any case, Sammy instinctively calls out to Jasmine to make sure she's okay, but that instantly grabs the monster's attention. It heads over to capture the twins, and as Amy gets wrapped up by the monster, she drops the decoy idol in the process. Sean reminds Max and Sammy that they need to return their idols in order to calm the monster down, so Max immediately runs to the exit. However, Sammy is distracted by Amy, who demands to be released from her constraints so that she can deliver the idol instead. Sammy pauses to consider the optics of abandoning her sister, but ultimately she picks up the decoy idol and leaves Amy just to spite her. As the monster sees Max and Sammy running away, Sean rushes in to distract it so they have time to escape. The monster prepares to attack Sean until Jasmine suddenly comes to his rescue, and they end up fighting the monster together. Max and Sammy race to the pedestal outside and place their idols at the same time, so the monster stops attacking and Jasmine and Sean hurry to free the other contestants. However, once everyone is outside, Chris announces that the salmon have won due to Max placing their idol on the pedestal by mistake. The bears are understandably pissed at Max for trying to cheat, and more importantly for screwing it up so badly, but before he can explain himself, the weakened monster limps out of the cave. This briefly startles the contestants until Chris reveals that the monster was an animatronic the whole time, which puts Sean at ease for the time being. So the challenge is finally over, and all the weird occurrences on the island are temporarily resolved, but while the bears go to eliminate Max, Amy convinces her team that Sammy is a bad person. She uses Sammy's abandonment of her as proof that she's telling the truth, and unfortunately the salmon believe her. So before Chris launches Max, Sammy interrupts the ceremony so she can leave too. She explains to Chris that she can't stand being around her sister for another minute, but when Chris sees this as an opportunity for sibling drama, he decides to switch Max and Sammy instead of eliminating them. I'm gonna be honest, this episode broke me. I usually try to focus on one video at a time, but this episode alone took an obscenely long time to write because sequencing all these character interactions was nearly impossible. I decided to stop writing last August because I wanted to prioritize my classes, but even after the semester ended, I didn't return to this script until January, and even then I only wrote occasionally. It was frustrating because I purposely made the story beats in my All-Stars rewrite as vague as possible so people could interpret the details however they wanted, but because my version of the Pahkitew cast is so different, I felt it was necessary to be as specific as possible in order to show how they function compared to the originals. Up until this point, I felt like I'd been keeping a good balance of being detailed while also staying concise, but this episode in particular had so many details that it would sound kind of lazy if I tried to simplify everything. It certainly didn't help that all this cutting between groups would probably feel really bloated and choppy in a 22-minute episode, but thankfully I stopped caring when I realized that pacing the episode wasn't my job. In any case, since I went through all the trouble of pulling multiple inspirations to create this episode, I can't end it without covering as many of them as possible, so now it's time to make my suffering everyone else's problem. The two Pahkitew Island episodes that this story takes the most inspiration from are This Is the Pits and Hurl and Go Seek. Of course, the episode's overall structure is borrowed from previous Total Drama episodes where a mysterious assailant stalks and picks off the contestants one by one, but the aforementioned episodes specifically inspired Jasmine and Sean's dynamic as well as the setting. Obviously, the stuck in a cave plotline is lifted from This Is the Pits, but instead of getting ignored by Topher for 20 minutes, Jasmine is paired with Sean so the audience can get a sense of what their relationship will eventually look like. It certainly helps that Sean treats Jasmine's claustrophobia seriously, similar to how Trent and Zoe comforted Gwen in previous episodes, but it also helps that this episode's monster isn't revealed to be fake until after it's defeated, because in my opinion, knowing that the zombie horde in Hurl and Go Seek was never a real threat severely undermined the impact of Sean's sacrifice during the climax of that episode. That being said, Sean himself is much closer to his canon characterization than at any other point in this rewrite. However, the circumstances leading up to this episode make his fear of a potential monster attack a lot more understandable than his general fear of zombies. By that I mean he's a horror enthusiast running around at night on like 1 hour of sleep, and in that context, paranoia almost sounds inevitable. That being said, the monster itself is kind of a red herring meant to distract Sean from discovering the truth of the island, but at the same time, since the monster is an animatronic, it also kind of functions as a clue hidden in plain sight for the audience. In general, this is the approach I wish the show had taken in regards to its foreshadowing, since most of the hints about the island's artificiality were either told and not shown, or spelled out so blatantly that the reveal wasn't even that shocking. But in any case, I'm just pointing this out because I wanted to structure this whole episode in a way that raised the audience's suspicions without revealing anything outright. Besides that, this episode's remaining influences are thankfully a lot less complicated than the ones I was just talking about. In Amy's case, her plan to turn the salmon against Sammy by victimizing herself was actually inspired by twinning It's in Everything. In that episode, she actually does these two things separately, but I decided to combine these ideas into an entire scheme to make Amy more threatening. Meanwhile, Dave and Sky's I Like You But conversation is ripped straight from A Blast from the Past, except Sky gets to say she has a boyfriend, which is an idea obviously taken from the finale. Her boyfriend is no longer real in this rewrite though, so technically Sky is lying to Dave, but at least in this context it comes from Sky's genuine desire to spare his feelings, rather than Dave being willfully ignorant, which is, annoying. Episode 7. After basically doing 2 challenges in one day, episode 7 starts on the following afternoon. Sammy has been thinking over everything that's happened, and after watching her sulk at the entrance of their cave all morning, Sean eventually decides to reach out and ask how she's doing. Sammy vents her frustration over Amy's deceit and her separation from Jasmine, but Sean reassures her that leaving that monster was the right decision. Sammy thinks he's talking figuratively about her sister, but honestly I think it'd be kind of funny if Sean was literally referring to the monster she had to run away from. Either way, he encourages Sammy to use this as an opportunity to reinvent herself, so Sammy decides to be the best member of the confused bears in order to prove her worth. Soon after their little heart-to-heart, Sky returns from fetching water or something and asks Sean if he's foraged yet. When Sean replies that he was just about to leave, Sammy volunteers to go with him so she can see Jasmine again. This makes Sky suspicious because the bears have already had 2 liars in a row, but in a confessional she does express hope that the rumors surrounding Sammy just aren't true. Meanwhile, at the floating salmon's treehouse, Jasmine asks around for a new foraging partner, only to get rejected by almost everyone. Amy dislikes Jasmine for associating with Sammy, Scarlett is allied with Amy so she's unwilling to trust her for the same reasons, and Max simply doesn't care enough to help her. Rodney is also hesitant to associate with Jasmine due to her reputation, but he's especially reluctant to do so now that Scarlett is against her. So he asks Beardo to go in his place, and he thankfully says yes, either because he's very forgiving of Jasmine, or he just wasn't paying attention in the last episode. In any case, he builds a decent rapport with Jasmine within the first few minutes of foraging together, but their conversation is cut short when Sammy finds them and the girls reunite. They both make sure the other is okay, and after a brief discussion about how to navigate their new team dynamics, they agree to work hard so they can eliminate Amy in the merge. With their goals set, Sammy actually gets super pumped about fighting her sister for once, and when Jasmine asks what got her to bounce back so quickly, she explains that Sean cheered her up right as he enters the scene. Jasmine goes quiet, so Sammy decides to give them space by talking to Beardo, and they proceed to talk about last night. Jasmine thanks Sean for helping her with her claustrophobia, while Sean thanks her for saving him from the monster, but when Jasmine hints at her deeper feelings, Sean freezes up. He admits in the confessional that he does like her back, but because they're competing and he's never had a girlfriend before, he doesn't know how to properly handle the situation. So when Chris announces that it's challenge time, Sean just kind of awkwardly backs out of the conversation, leaving Jasmine all by herself. This leaves a lot of tension between them once they get to the meeting spot, but Dave's melodramatic attempts to hide his heartbreak over Sky will hopefully lighten the mood. As for the challenge, I don't exactly know what it will be, but for the purposes of this story, let's just say it's some kind of construction challenge. Like, the salmon will need to build a large structure within a certain time limit, while the bears must knock it down before they can finish it. I'm mostly setting up the challenge this way because I wanted to slow things down after 2 episodes of running, but also half the plot hinges on Scarlett building a contraption for her team, and it's just easier to do that if she's already sitting with a bunch of building materials. The materials themselves will still come from a junk pile like in episode 1, but some of the components will be more high-tech to further foreshadow the island's true nature. Once the teams are dismissed, Rodney immediately jumps at the opportunity to talk to Scarlett using the technique he learned from Beardo. He's especially eager to connect with her after all the crazy stuff that happened in the last episode, but unfortunately Amy gets in his way so she can reaffirm her confidence in Scarlett's abilities. In reality, this is just a ploy to get Scarlett to do all the planning for her, but because they have to build such a large structure, the salmon must divide their labor to cover more ground, so they split into 2 groups. Group A consists of Scarlett, Max, and Rodney, while Group B is made of Amy, Jasmine, and Beardo. I don't know how the characters will justify this arrangement, but it basically serves so that Max can cockblock Rodney and gain access to Scarlett's device later in the episode, whereas Beardo functions as a neutral third party to Amy and Jasmine's bickering. In any case, all this organization gives the bears a head start on planning, which they try to execute pretty early on. Every member contributes an idea, but since Sky is still somewhat skeptical of Sammy, she prioritizes everyone else's ideas over hers. And so, before the salmon have made much progress on their structure, the bears attack Group A until Scarlett finishes the device I mentioned earlier and forces the bears to retreat. Scarlett's machine intrigues Max, and he immediately suggests ways to improve it, but because it's so delicate and prone to malfunctioning, Scarlett forbids him from touching it, though obviously this doesn't stop him from wanting to do so. But anyway, even though their first disruption attempt was a disaster, once the bears manage to get to safety, they immediately rework their plan and decide to target Group B. As soon as they get there, Jasmine and Amy are already arguing over who should be in charge, but when Amy threatens to tell the other salmon that Jasmine is colluding with the enemy, she eventually complies. This is convenient because it means that they're all on the same page when the bears launch their attack, though Beardo does manage to screw up Amy's plan, much to her annoyance. Group B does manage to course correct and send the bears away once more, but this little slip-up serves to set up Amy's disdain for Beardo in the next episode. This cycle repeats for a while, where the bears try to attack the salmon only to be sent back, until eventually the bears have no choice but to give Sammy's idea a chance. The idea itself will probably be something along the lines of stealing stuff from the salmon's scrap pile and using it against them, though there's probably a more character-specific way for Sammy to approach the problem. Either way, the bears are successful enough in overwhelming Amy's group that they eventually draw the attention of Scarlett, who goes to help Group B. Rodney joins her so they can handle the problem together, but this leaves Max all alone with Scarlett's device, and I think you kind of know where this is going. As expected, he tampers with the machine only for it to malfunction, but in addition to that, it ends up destroying the salmon's entire structure in the process. This happens gradually, so Sammy still has time to put Amy through a humiliating defeat that somehow involves Beardo, but ultimately, the real loser of this episode actually ends up being Scarlet. After the salmon lose, Max pins all the blame on Scarlet's device, and since her machine was faulty to begin with, Jasmine and Beardo just end up believing him. It doesn't help that her intelligence wasn't as much of an asset as Amy was hoping for it to be, so she ends up voting for Scarlet too. The only one who doesn't vote for her is Rodney. However, despite finally having the confidence to talk to Scarlet, in typical Total Drama fashion, Chris shoots her from the cannon before they have a chance to speak. Overall, Scarlet has a pretty rough time, but on that note, now is probably the best time to address all the changes I made to Scarlet before I get a million of the same questions about her in the comments. The main question I should answer is, why did I nerf Scarlet instead of realizing her villainous potential? The answer to this should be pretty obvious to most people, but since there's still a sizable portion of fans who think she could have still worked as the main villain, let me lay down where I'm coming from. Firstly, while the show does foreshadow her evil nature, the pacing and escalation of Scarlet's villainy was very spotty. For example, while she takes interest in Max's evil schemes as early as episode 2, I'd argue that her actions don't really take on a malicious tone until episode 5 when she bends the rules to electrocute Ella. During episodes 6 and 7, she tries to get rid of Max, but that's more a result of him being annoying than of her being evil. She doesn't really do anything evil in episode 8 besides glare at Topher, and in episode 9 she mostly just plans to use Max as a sort of human shield, which again is more smart than evil. But then suddenly in episode 10 she's just fully ready to kill the other contestants in cold blood because she's secretly been evil this whole time. It's a very extreme jump from disgruntled lackey to over-the-top supervillain, and while I understand that she was just trying to hide her true nature, I feel like the writers didn't fully think through the implications of making Scarlet evil the entire time. Like, when she made sarcastic comments and rolled her eyes at Max's ideas in episode 2 and 3, why did she decide to help him anyway? Couldn't she come up with her own ideas instead of bumming them off this imbecile? It doesn't even make sense that she continues to pair up with Max in episodes 7 and 10, because she has way better options by that point and has already established that she hates him. In those episodes specifically, it's not like she's even above killing Max, so why didn't she just leave him to die instead of guiding Max to safety and then complaining that he's around her? I don't know, maybe I'm just being really nitpicky, but it really feels like the only reason Scarlet hangs out with Max is so that she can have a villain arc, no matter how confusing and passive it makes her look in retrospect. That being said, I still don't think Scarlet would be a good main antagonist even if she had a more reasonable trajectory or clearer motives, because the main reason Scarlet doesn't work as a villain is that her chemistry with the rest of the cast is near non-existent. That's not an inherent problem for villains of the week, who are basically just obstacles rather than characters, but for Scarlet it means the writers don't have any fun dynamics to play with even if they wanted her to stay longer. Defeating her effectively means nothing because none of her character traits conflict with the other contestants in a meaningful way, and in my opinion that's ultimately why her elimination in the show fell so flat. It has no long-term impact on anyone's character development, and it certainly doesn't help that her only other major contribution, which is revealing the island's secret, sees very limited use until the finale. That's why I felt the need to cut away so much of Scarlet's character. Making her a villain just isn't worth it. Her relationship with Max is pretty much the only part of her character that I kept, and even that has been heavily condensed and modified so that Max latches onto Scarlet instead of the other way around. As for her relationships with Amy and Rodney, it might seem like a bit of a waste for her to establish connections with them only for her to be eliminated, but I wrote it this way so these two characters could fill the void left in her absence. I'll admit it's a bit disrespectful towards Scarlet's value as an individual, but at the very least her absence will impact someone, and she can still reasonably make her way into a second season. In any case, I just hope my changes to Scarlet don't diminish the episode's overall purpose of establishing the other characters' new dynamics, specifically Jasmine, Amy, Sammy, and Sean's. In Sammy and Sean's case, I mostly made them friends to show that Sean was good boyfriend material, since getting along with your crush's best friend just seems like a green flag. However, I also just felt it was important to give Sammy a new friend going into her new team. Sammy's grit and resilience are probably the most important factors in Sean's ability to connect with her, but it helps that literally any friendships are welcome additions to this season. By contrast, Sean's relationship with Jasmine faces its first hurdle as his sudden awkwardness brings their easygoing rapport to a halt. Functionally, Sean's reluctance to reciprocate Jasmine's feelings serves to put their relationship on hold until the merge, similar to their zombie-based conflict from A Blast from the Past, but instead of arguing over just like a dumb misunderstanding, this conflict stems from a more reasonable concern over how their relationship would even work when they're on opposite teams. Compared to their canon relationship, this approach to their romantic drama is a lot more conventional, but in Sean's case I think that's ultimately for the best. As for Jasmine, her focus isn't really on Sean in this episode, but that's mostly just because she has to deal with Amy's lust for power first. Up until this point, Jasmine and Amy's interactions have primarily been responses to the other's treatment of Sammy and nothing more, but this episode finally shows us that Amy's superiority complex extends far beyond her sister. We see this in the way she coerces Jasmine and manipulates Scarlet. However, Amy's power hunger is ultimately shown to be self-destructive, as the floating salmon's downfall is partially due to their unstable leadership. This is in direct contrast to Sammy, whose introduction to the Confused Bears marks the end of their 3-episode-long losing streak. It's a fairly quick turnaround for both of them, but I wanted to convey the intensity of the twins' back and forth by linking the changes in their respective teams to their own personal growth. Episode 8. After trying so hard to connect with Scarlet only to get blocked at every turn, Episode 8 opens with Rodney mourning over Scarlet's elimination. As usual, Beardo listens while Max completely ignores him, until Jasmine comes by to pick up Beardo so they can forge together. Beardo tells Rodney to get some fresh air, and as they leave, Jasmine orders Amy to help with chores. Amy tries to fight back, but now that Scarlet is gone, she has significantly less influence over the team. The story then immediately cuts to the other team foraging as Sammy and Sean celebrate their win from yesterday. They exchange compliments to show they've grown closer until Jasmine calls out to Sammy and asks where Sean is. Sammy is confused when she turns and sees that Sean has just straight up disappeared, but she brushes it off as Jasmine goes on to tell her about the conversation they had yesterday. She explains how she essentially confessed her feelings and didn't get a response, so she asks Sammy to send Sean to her as soon as possible. She then decides to forage elsewhere with Beardo, and he comments on how Jasmine has so many good ideas, showing that he's warmed up to her. Once Jasmine and Beardo are gone, Sean finally comes out of hiding and Sammy asks why he's being so distant. Sean explains his reservations about crushing on the enemy, along with his general uncertainty about how he'd confess in the first place, but Sammy encourages him to speak up before it's too late. Firstly, because he already knows Jasmine likes him back anyway, but also because she doesn't want Sean to break her best friend's heart. Still, Sean expresses his doubts until Sammy offers to be his wingman. After this scene, the story returns to the Salmon's treehouse where Amy is on the deck doing chores. She becomes increasingly frustrated by the task at hand, as well as the shift in power that led her to this point, until she concludes that she needs to find a new ally ASAP. Luckily for her, Rodney steps out of the treehouse for some fresh air right as she says this. However, he accidentally knocks Amy over the edge of the railing and she almost falls off the deck completely. Rodney does manage to save her and he apologizes profusely, but Amy is furious until he explains why he was so distracted. Basically, he's been unable to think straight after so many romantic failures, and Amy realizes that she can take advantage of Rodney's emotionally vulnerable state by pretending to like him. However, there's no time for her to enact this plan just yet, as Chris calls the contestants to the meeting area. At this point, I've literally run out of challenge ideas. All I know is that it will come in 2 parts, preferably with both teams in close proximity to each other. In terms of foreshadowing the island twist, it might be fun if this challenge took place in the same location as a previous one, and then, the contestants will just remark upon how quickly Chris transformed the area, but otherwise I don't know how else to incorporate technology into the game itself. But anyway, once the challenge starts, Sean avoids Jasmine and continues to do so throughout the episode. Jasmine begins to worry that he doesn't like her back, so Sammy asks her teammates for dating advice. Specifically, she asks if Dave has a girlfriend, to which he responds no. However, he does mention that Sky has a boyfriend, so Sammy starts asking her a bunch of questions that force her to lie a lot more. Granted, Sky does feel guilty about lying since all this boyfriend talk proceeds to crush Dave both emotionally and competitively, but she finds it harder and harder to admit the truth as she digs herself into a deeper and deeper hole. This puts the burden of keeping the bears together on Sean, and conveniently this gives him yet another excuse to continue avoiding Jasmine. In the meantime, Jasmine decides to focus on her own team after Sean's initial rejection, and very quickly she gains Beardo's support with more of her good ideas. Obviously, the ideas will be related to the challenge, but in any case, this motivates Amy to start securing her own alliance by flirting with Rodney. She apologizes for getting mad at him earlier and even compliments him, and so, as expected by this point, Rodney falls for her immediately and does everything she says. And so although the salmon begin the challenge by following Jasmine's plan, Rodney helps them finish the first part under Amy's direction. Tensions between the salmon rise during part 2 as Jasmine, Amy, and Max all propose different plans for Rodney and Beardo to pick from. Eliminating Max's plan is easy, though he's obviously not happy about it, but Rodney has a much harder time choosing between the girls' ideas. Amy tries to persuade him into choosing her plan so she can be in charge, but Rodney ultimately defers to Beardo, who chooses Jasmine's plan again. This causes Amy to target Beardo because if he has more influence over Rodney, then it'll be much harder to control his behavior later on. However, she also just doesn't like Beardo that much after he embarrassed her in the last episode. So when Beardo gets a key role in Jasmine's plan, Amy takes this as an opportunity to sabotage him. For the sake of an example, let's just say the plan requires Beardo to sing, so when it's finally time to use his amazing vocal talents, Amy just stomps on his foot to mess him up. Somehow this results in him ruining Jasmine's plan, and in the process he also embarrasses Max, which gives most of the salmon a reason to vote Beardo off. Once again, Rodney is the only one who's hesitant to do so, but as part of her aggressive bid to gain his loyalty, Amy convinces Rodney to vote against Beardo by lying about all the horrible ways he's mistreated her. Rodney unfortunately falls for this as easily as he fell for Amy, and so Beardo is eliminated by his entire team. That's about it for the salmon, but between the bears, there's one more scene that I need to cover before moving on. Directly after the challenge, Sky pulls Sammy aside to admit that she isn't actually dating anyone. She asks Sammy to keep this a secret while she figures out how to break the news to Dave, and thankfully Sammy agrees to shut up. However, unbeknownst to Sky, Dave walks in on the tail end of their conversation and ends up misinterpreting Sky's apprehension as her having a secret crush on him. He thinks she was hiding her feelings so they wouldn't get in the way of the competition, but he's determined to prove that her feelings are correct no matter how much she denies them. And I think that's basically it for this episode. I usually use this part in each section to clarify things that might be confusing and explain changes from the canon material, but most of it is pretty self-explanatory, so I guess I'll move on. Episode 9. Similar to the previous episode, episode 9 opens yet again with Rodney moping around, this time feeling guilty for voting off Beardo. The double gut punch of losing his second crush and then his closest friend seriously eats him up inside, but Amy reassures him that it was the right decision and that, at least he still has her. Rodney is grateful for Amy's support, but the moment is quickly ruined as Max barges into their conversation, followed by Jasmine. She's convinced him to forage with her, so he's just kind of looking for stuff to bring with him, but Amy is not entertained by their sudden intrusion, so she leaves the room with Rodney. She and Jasmine exchange dirty looks as they exit, but once they're gone, Jasmine admits in a confessional that she feels a bit envious of Amy's bond with Rodney. Meanwhile, in the confused Bears' cave, Dave prepares to court Sky, only for him to immediately fuck it up. For the sake of an example, let's just say he accidentally pushes her into a pile of mud, so Sky is forced to stop whatever she's doing so she can clean herself up. She asks for Sean's help since she doesn't want to rely on Dave or Sammy after the last episode, but Sean declines because he wants to try confessing to Jasmine again. At least, that's what he wants to do, but Dave insists on taking his place so he can pick an apology bouquet for Sky. Sean tries to argue against it, but he eventually relents, hoping that Jasmine doesn't take his absence as a bad sign. Unfortunately, Jasmine is already having a rough time since she's hanging with Max. She tries her best to establish a connection with him so Amy and Rodney don't vote her off, but after being humiliated in the last episode, Max is too focused on gaining some respect to care about forming an alliance with her. Instead, he just tries to look like a badass wilderness survivor like Jasmine, only to do something completely foolish that disappoints her, like picking poison ivy or getting bitten by a snake or something. Sammy arrives just in time to lift Jasmine's spirits, but when Dave shows up instead of Sean, she's immediately let down again. Sammy explains that Sean was busy, hoping that Jasmine will understand, as Max pesters Dave in the background, but Jasmine is very disappointed to learn that Sean is avoiding her yet again. She feels very neglected, so she tells Sammy that since talking to her is clearly too much for Sean, she'll just focus on the game for now. Sammy panics and tries to reassure Jasmine that Sean is still into her, but Jasmine doubts that someone brave enough to save her from a monster would be this scared to talk to her, especially when conversation usually comes to them so naturally. Either way, Jasmine is just not interested in pressuring him for a response, though she does thank Sammy for trying to spare her feelings. Sammy, on the other hand, is not willing to let this go, but because Chris interrupts them to announce that it's challenge time, they must report to the meeting area before she can convince Jasmine that she's telling the truth. Once the teams come together, the rift between Sean and Jasmine grows even wider as the challenge is revealed to be a race that's designed to keep them apart for most of the episode. Each team will travel in a Mad Max-style vehicle of their own creation, and they'll use some kind of non-lethal weapon like Chef's tennis ball blaster to gain points by shooting targets around the island. There are multiple detours with different obstacles and point values to make the game more interesting, but all paths converge at the end so that the teams can confront each other during the climax. The challenge ends when one team crosses the finish line, but before they start racing, each team must first put their vehicle together. And so throughout part 1, Amy just kind of continues to flirt with Rodney so he does all the heavy lifting for her. However, while she successfully maintains control over him, she slowly grows annoyed with his clingy personality. Jasmine goes back to following Amy's directions so she doesn't get eliminated, though her envy toward Amy and Rodney adds an extra sting to their interactions. As for Max, he schemes against the Bears but fails repeatedly. Meanwhile, Dave prepares a romantic surprise for Sky and hints at it throughout the episode. He basically plans to do every romantic gesture Sky said her boyfriend did because he thinks they were hints to her actual interests, but in reality, everything she mentioned was just a random romance trope that she chose on the spot. Sky fails to pick up on Dave's plans since she's too busy looking for the right time to tell him the truth, and Sammy urges Sean to confess to Jasmine, but no matter how many opportunities she creates for them, Sean either chickens out or gets cock-blocked, which frustrates both of them. By the end of the building phase, Sky stumbles upon Dave's supplies and realizes what he's doing, so she finally tells him the truth to stop Dave from embarrassing himself. This revelation leaves Dave heartbroken, but when he finds the one thing that he knows Sky can't resist, he decides to go through with his romantic gesture anyway. For the sake of an example, let's just say that Sky expressed her desire to see fireworks after winning at the Olympics in episode 6, and the only thing Dave retained from that conversation is Sky likes fireworks. Anyway, in part 2, everyone mostly just focuses on the challenge like normal. Dave still tries to flirt with Sky, and Amy orders Rodney to take down Sammy whenever their paths cross, but otherwise the challenge is pretty standard until their paths converge for the last time. Once the Bears take the lead, Dave decides to celebrate early by performing his romantic gesture, but just like in the beginning of the episode, this attempt to charm Sky proceeds to go horribly wrong. Since Dave's plan involves surprise fireworks, I hope it's not a shock to anyone that neither team was really expecting to face a sudden onslaught of lights, noise, and fire. In the case of the Bears, it leads them to swerve uncontrollably, but for the Salmon, it causes Jasmine to fall off of their vehicle and onto the edge of a cliff. Sean wants to stop so they can save her, but the Bears are too busy trying to get back on the road to help him, so he jumps out of the car while the rest of his team continues without him. Likewise, Rodney questions if they should go back for Jasmine, but Amy just says to keep going. As Sean runs to the cliff, Jasmine's grip on the edge begins to weaken. He tries to get to her in time, but she appears to fall off and just die. Sean audibly vocalizes his regret that he didn't tell her about his feelings earlier, but since Jasmine's death is obviously a fake-out, she calls out for Sean's help, and he's able to pull her back up. Once they're on safer ground, Sean begins to frantically explain himself and why he's been avoiding her, but Jasmine just kisses him and says she already heard everything she needs to hear. Is this scene kind of corny? Yes, but it conveys that they're finally a couple and basically serves as a replacement for the scene in Hurl and Go Seek where Sean saves Jasmine, minus the fake zombie stuff. But anyway, back to the rest of the action. The teams are neck and neck as both of their vehicles barrel toward the finish line. The Bears temporarily pull ahead only to miss the finish line completely, and while the Salmon manage to win, they still end up crashing and Max is comedically thrown out of their vehicle and into a tree. So obviously at the elimination ceremony, the Bears all vote for Dave. Sky does it because she feels really awkward around him, Sean and Sammy are angry that he endangered their friend, and overall he's just clearly responsible for their team losing. Sky still tries to be nice to Dave before he gets launched from the cannon, but once again, Dave misinterprets her words and basically convinces himself that he had the right idea, just the wrong execution. So right as Dave leaves, he vows to pursue Sky again in the next season. It's honestly not that different from where Dave leaves off in the real episode 9, but at least now there's some actual build-up to his elimination, as opposed to him just campaigning to get eliminated off-screen. Overall, I still don't like this version of Dave that much more than his canon counterpart, but I at least tried to rein him in a little so that he'd hopefully be less annoying. Specifically, he only asks to be Sky's boyfriend once rather than multiple times, and his emotions aren't nearly as erratic as they were in the real episode 9. That being said, I still want to take time to rant about Dave because, like Scarlett, I want to get ahead of the people who might be asking why I don't like him. However, I also just haven't had many opportunities to talk about him or Sky since their relationship was way less of a focal point in this rewrite. But anyway, since I've already discussed how Dave is a whiny, judgmental bitch in the introduction, I'd like to build on that sentiment by asking, what does Sky even like about Dave in the first place? In episode 1, he interrupts Sky to praise her plan, even though it's literally their first interaction. At the start of episode 3, Dave insists on foraging with Sky and Sean because he's too insecure to leave her alone with another guy. Episode 5 obviously has the infamous I like you but scene, where Dave ignores Sky, insults her aspirations, and then interrupts her again. And in episode 6, he insults her plan only to go through with it anyway so that he'll look like a good boyfriend. In episode 7, Dave says, "Score! Near-death experiences always make girls want to kiss," which is just... yikes. And in episode 9, Dave refuses to accept Sky's rejection after she repeatedly makes it clear that she doesn't want to date him. He also enjoys the prospect of hurting Sky just a little too much in the finale, whereas Jasmine is at least kind of concerned about Sean's well-being. But my point is that Dave doesn't have any redeeming qualities besides being cute, according to Sky. He doesn't share her interests, he never helps her in a moment of crisis, he rarely makes meaningful contributions to their team, and in fact most of the time, Dave is counterproductive in all these respects. He interrupts Sky multiple times, insults her interests, is critical and pessimistic, whereas Sky at least tries to be constructive about their team, and generally, he comes off as someone that doesn't fully respect the people around him, including the girl he's attracted to. He doesn't even have an overarching goal for the money, which is infuriating because it means he signed up for a notoriously disgusting show and then had the audacity to complain about everything being too dirty. Don't get me wrong, I would be the same if I was forced onto the show, but Dave literally chose to be here. I feel like so many people are of the opinion that Dave was really good in the first half of the show, and it's only around episode 9 that he got ruined, but in my opinion his whole character was just a collection of small red flags that was inevitably going to culminate in something worse down the line. Even if you tried to argue that Sky was just as toxic as Dave for being really indecisive and indirect, I still find it hard to blame her when she never set out to hurt Dave intentionally. Well, at least not until the finale. I will admit that kissing Dave so that he'd be more useful to her was kind of a dick move since it's pretty willfully deceptive, but even then, that's the only time she manipulates Dave's feelings deliberately, and I don't think it justifies Dave's violent response. Of course, he only has such an extreme reaction because Chris provokes him and gives Dave the tools to act on his feelings, but it still doesn't reflect well on Dave that the only thing standing between him and his desire to hurt Sky is a remote control. It's just so disproportionate to the reveal that Sky had a boyfriend, which in itself was also a very questionable writing choice. I've seen some people try to argue that this plot point proves that Sky is a manipulative jerk, but since there was no indication of Keith's existence prior to the finale, it's pretty obvious to me that he was just a hastily written plot device designed to make Dave more aggressive for the final challenge. That's what Sean's confessionals were used for, but since the writers didn't have any dirt on Sky, they just had to make something up, and then immediately backpedal so that Sky still felt deserving of the money afterward. And even if you take the revelation at face value, again, Sky doesn't acknowledge Keith in any of her previous confessionals, so to me it seems like she essentially forgot about him as soon as Dave entered the picture. I mean, that's still bad, but in that case you can't then accuse Sky of hiding her boyfriend from Dave because he literally didn't cross her mind once during the entire season. And I guess that's why I was so adamant about removing Sky's attraction to Dave and pushing their relationship all the way into the background. There are just so many red flags and so few redeeming qualities to their relationship that I didn't want to deal with it, at least not in this season. They'll probably still play out some of their story beats from the real show in the next season, but at least in that context Dave will be delusional from the start and can therefore antagonize Sky for more than one episode. Sky also tries to make her disinterest in Dave clear in this episode, so any misunderstanding from this point forward is squarely Dave's fault. Episode 10. Okay, so this is day 2 of recording because yesterday my throat was not having it. Now that the cast has dropped to half capacity, episode 10 begins with Chris waking up the players to announce that it's finally time for the merge. He wastes no time and goes straight into explaining the day's challenge, which turns out to be one long hike across the island with 3 pathways. Each path will have unique obstacles placed there by Chris, but unbeknownst to the players, he'll also be altering the weather and terrain in secret, which the contestants will comment upon throughout the episode. The first group to make it to the end wins immunity, and yes, I did say groups, since multiple contestants are heading down the same road anyway. Before the teams disperse, Chris also announces that an immunity idol is now in play, just because if I set it up later in the season, I feel like it'll be a little too obvious that that's the episode when someone is actually going to find it. But anyway, the composition for the first 2 teams should already be pretty obvious. Now that their original teams have dissolved, Jasmine finally gets to reunite with Sammy and Sean to form Team 1, whereas Amy and Rodney stay together to make Team 2. Sky tries to join Team 2 since Sammy and Sean haven't been the most reliable teammates as of late, but since Amy is keen on maintaining control over Rodney, she gets rejected. This leaves Max as Sky's only other option for a partner, and so after the other groups select the first 2 paths, Sky and Max begrudgingly head down the final path together, though things between them deteriorate pretty quickly. This is mostly because Sky doesn't trust Max to play fairly after his disastrous attempt at cheating in episode 6. However, Max is also bitter at Sky for trying to vote him off when he was just trying to help their team win. This tension comes to a head pretty quickly as Sky adds to Max's already lengthy history of humiliation during their first obstacle, and they immediately get into an argument over it. Max eventually storms off, and with no indication that he'll ever come back, Sky just kind of decides to continue on without him. So that's a pretty rough start for Team 3, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the other two groups fare much better. In the case of the friendship trio, Sammy realizes that while they work well in pairs, they haven't exactly figured out their dynamic as a group. Specifically, they all contribute ideas on how to overcome each obstacle, but Jasmine consistently chooses Sean's ideas over Sammy's. She doesn't do this out of malice or, favoritism. They're just genuinely good ideas. But by the end of the episode, Sammy begins to feel a little neglected. Meanwhile, Rodney tries to keep his romance alive with Amy, but Amy is so desperate to win immunity that she begins to view Rodney's sentimentality as a distraction. As the episode progresses, she responds to his romantic gestures with increasing impatience and exasperation, until she eventually just starts shutting him up so that they can move faster. This results in Rodney feeling deeply unappreciated, but instead of acknowledging the fact that he's unhappy, he convinces himself that this is just normal couple behavior. So basically everyone's having a rough time in this episode, until Max eventually falls into some kind of booby trap that hurls him through the entrance of the island's secret underground facility. Once he gets up, Max wanders through the halls of the building, curious about where he's landed, until he manages to find his way to the control room. At first he thinks it's merely for surveillance, but after fiddling with the controls a bit, he realizes what this place is, and decides to mess with the other contestants for the rest of the episode. Specifically, as Sky makes her way to the finish line, Max picks on her by essentially putting her on a conveyor belt and destroying the massive lead she had gained after leaving him. Likewise, the friendship trio also struggles to reach the end since Chris has been particularly keen on slowing them down, until Rodney and Amy win the challenge and gain immunity. This leaves the friendship trio unable to eliminate their biggest enemy or her second-in-command, and so their votes kind of naturally end up going to the island's next biggest threat, which is Sky. Sky herself is pretty disappointed that she came this far only to get eliminated, but after Chris launches her out of the cannon, he begins to sign off. However, when he says there are 6 players remaining, the other contestants point out that only 5 of them are present. They pause to consider who could possibly be missing when suddenly the ground begins to shake, and large rocky spikes rise from the lake to encircle the island, among other changes. A monitor comes out of the ground from where Chris is standing, and Max appears to announce his takeover of the island. Episode 11. Episode 11 picks up right where 10 left off, with Max trapping Chris and the other contestants as the environment goes haywire. Once his enclosure of the island is complete, Max monologues to everyone about how foolish they've been to underestimate him, and he refuses to return control of the island back to Chris until he listens to his demands. Chris immediately declines to do so, which leads to a brief argument between them before the other players interrupt to ask what the hell is going on. Chris explains that after the destruction of Camp Wawanakwa, the producers wanted him to build a more durable setting that he had more control over, so he decided to construct what is essentially a very large floating structure. He was planning to tell the players earlier, but since construction was still underway at the start of the season, he decided to reveal Pahkitew Island's secret as part of the finale instead. The contestants still don't see this as an adequate explanation, and so they continue to ask a string of follow-up questions until Max draws their attention back to him with a show of power. At the risk of being interrupted again, Max cuts to the chase and demands that Chris hand over the $1 million, but when Chris refuses to give in, mostly because he won't get paid as much if the season is cut short, Max threatens to activate the island's self-destruct sequence in response. Chris thinks he's bluffing, but when Max pulls up the countdown before ending his transmission, everyone begins to panic. The contestants ask why the island would even need a self-destruct button, to which Chris responds that if the island's maintenance got too expensive, he was just going to blow it up and collect the property damage money. But after that, he and Chef try to get everyone to safety using the Zeppelin, until Max either puts the Zeppelin offline or destroys it remotely. So with everyone stranded and the island's destruction imminent, Chris decides to face the problem head-on by turning the crisis into a challenge of sorts, with the primary goal of stopping Max. While Chris and his interns stay on the surface to establish communications with Max, the contestants are tasked with infiltrating the control room in case negotiations go south. Chef hands out walkie-talkies so he can guide them through the island's underground complex since they're the only technology not hooked up to the internet, and each group is given a code to deactivate the island's self-destruct sequence. The contestants then split up and enter different ends of the complex to cover more ground, but Max overhears their plans through the island's surveillance system and prepares to defend himself. So throughout the first half of the episode, the contestants are basically just dodging traps and obstacles that Max has erected to impede their progress. However, each team also carries over their emotional baggage from the previous episode, which means that Amy is bossing around Rodney more than ever before. Rodney wants to believe that Amy's harsh attitude is temporary and merely a result of their stressful situation, but when she activates a trap that they could escape together, he's disappointed to see her abandon him. She says that she's going to get help, and Rodney encourages her to go, but once Amy is gone, he's very clearly worried that she isn't coming back. Likewise, Jasmine continues to take Sean's suggestions over Sammy's, which delivers a massive blow to Sammy's self-confidence. She begins to feel like a third wheel and becomes increasingly insecure about the state of their relationship until she's separated from the group by a trapdoor. In the meantime, Chris finally manages to connect with Max, and after going back and forth for a while, he eventually agrees to transfer the money. Max is absolutely ecstatic that one of his plans has finally worked, and he tries to shut down the island's self-destruct sequence as promised. He kind of realizes that he doesn't actually know how to, and he ends up panicking and starts pressing random buttons to fix it. In the process, he accidentally cuts contact with Chris, which he tries to fix with even more button mashing, but instead he ends up causing the whole system to malfunction, essentially switching the facility's defenses to hard mode. This is bad news for everyone, including Max, who now has to be saved from the consequences of his own actions. However, Jasmine and Sean manage to hold up pretty well due to their complementary skill sets. On their way to the control room, they even find Rodney and save him, though he's initially reluctant to receive their help, knowing that they're Amy's enemies. He's also still somewhat jealous of Sean for taking Jasmine away from him, but after seeing how healthy their relationship is, he begins to question his own relationship with Amy. Conversely, when Sammy's trapdoor finally lands her in front of Amy, she immediately tries to get away from her. Amy tries to abandon her too, since she wants nothing to do with her sister either, but after each of them encounter their own impossible obstacles, they both go back and begrudgingly agree to work together. Unfortunately, they still end up in a shitty situation anyway, like they get trapped in the Chris bot storage room or something, and because it's Sammy's fault, Amy demeans her by calling her useless. This prompts Sammy to argue that she is in fact not useless. However, when she brings up her recent struggle to contribute to her friend's new dynamic, Amy suggests that perhaps Jasmine just doesn't need her anymore. Mind you, Amy doesn't even say this for strategic purposes, her opinion of her sister is just genuinely that low, but this scene helps to illuminate Sammy's deepest fears while also exacerbating them. Specifically, it reveals that she's afraid of losing her friends, along with the unique identity that she's built around them, and while she should know better than to listen to Amy, I wanted to show how, despite growing so much, Sammy's insecurities run deep, especially when Amy is the one voicing those doubts. But anyway, after that whole interaction, the show cuts back to Jasmine, Sean, and Rodney, who eventually make it to the control room. Rodney breaks down the door with his incredible strength, while the other two apprehend Max, but when they order him to shut off the self-destruct sequence, he explains that he doesn't have the codes for it. The other contestants realize that both of their codes are still with Amy and Sammy, so they go to rescue the twins in a sequence similar to the Chris bot scene from Scarlet Fever. And once the players input the code to stop the island from exploding, Chris finally calls the authorities to escort Max to juvie or prison or whatever. It's very similar to Duncan's ending in All Stars, but instead of transforming the series' beloved bad boy into a shell of his former self, the concept is being applied to someone who's always been a cringy wannabe. It helps that this ending gives closure to Max's desire to be taken seriously, whereas Chris being done with evil kind of just felt like an excuse for the writers to get rid of him. However, it also helps that Max is too incompetent to replicate this disaster, so it's not as dangerous if he returns for a second season, unlike Scarlet. That being said, I still felt like it was important to emphasize the gravity of the situation by forcing Chris to care about it, because his disregard for the characters' lives in the real Scarlet Fever kind of ruined the tension. It's not like Chris's opinion should dictate the way the audience feels, but it's kind of hard to care about the situation at large when the episode itself keeps insisting that it doesn't matter, even when being trapped in an island with a homicidal maniac should have been the show's most dramatic plotline ever. That's why I stranded him on the island with the contestants so that he has to care. Because while he still has selfish motivations, at least now his overall response is a lot more logical and human, which helps to keep the episode tonally consistent. As for the twist itself, I'm honestly just hoping that it's satisfying in some capacity, because in spite of my attempts to properly foreshadow it, it still feels a little bit rushed to me. In fairness, I think a lot of this is just because a twist of this magnitude is really hard to pull off in general, but it doesn't help that Total Drama's fast-paced structure doesn't really lend itself well to slow, methodical world-building. Like, if a contestant left their team to investigate the island, it would probably result in their elimination, but if every challenge was slowed down to accommodate a story like this, the show might get too repetitive and boring. You know, like, if every challenge was like that sleeping challenge from the first season, it would get really boring if that happened like multiple episodes in a row. I assume that's why most of the real show's foreshadowing from Jasmine and Sean was handled in their downtime, but as a result, most of those scenes came off as irrelevant non sequiturs or just bizarre hallucinations. I guess it'd be like if Chris didn't tell the Revenge cast about the toxic wasted mutants until episode 7, and then the lead up to that reveal was just Cameron saying, "Hey, there's something weird about those squirrels," every other episode before moving on. The only observations in the show that actually went anywhere were Scarlett's, and even then she only happened to discover things about the island because of Max, not because she was actively looking for stuff. In fact, she doesn't even think about looking into the island's artificiality, despite hypothesizing that the caves in episode 7 might not be the only artificial thing on the island. Granted, it might also be because the challenge for episode 8 was a race that she couldn't feasibly walk away from, but that just proves my initial point that total drama structure doesn't lend itself to a twist of this nature. A mystery like this requires too much downtime in a show that heavily revolves on keeping the characters busy, and so the build-up toward this reveal ends up feeling kind of weirdly staggered. That's why I wanted Chris to be transparent about the island's technology from the beginning. That way it doesn't feel as jarring when the big twist of the season turns out to be that everything is mechanical. So, like, it starts with simple things like lasers, drones, and Sean hearing weird noises at night, before gradually escalating into more conspicuous things like inconsistent maze layouts, secret levers, animatronics, and completely new environments sprung from thin air. It's not perfect, but at least it incorporates the twists into each episode's story, unlike half of the foreshadowing from the real show, and while the island reveal provides a cohesive explanation for all the island's weird inconsistencies, each anomaly can also be explained in the moment as the characters either misremembering or seeing things, which makes them a lot less confusing on an initial viewing. With all that in mind, I still feel like making this twist work is an exercise in futility, because overall I feel like Pahkitew's story would have been much better if it had just stuck to its initial theme of being a wild island. I mean, wilderness survival is literally what brought this season's main couple together, but instead of focusing on the difficulties of the natural environment, a lot of the challenges just focused on things that they just as easily could have done in Camp Wawanakwa. Maybe that's why the writers decided to make the island robotic, to like inject more excitement into the setting, but if that's the case, then I wish they had integrated it more deeply into the rest of the season, instead of basically only making it relevant to Scarlett and like the last 5 minutes of the finale. Episode 12. Since it doesn't make sense for anyone to continue living in the Confused Bear's cave now that the teams have been dissolved, episode 12 starts with everyone waking up in the Floating Salmon's treehouse instead. Rather than being split by gender, the house is just split by affiliation, so Sammy and Sean both wake up on Jasmine's side of the cabin and comment on how they've missed having beds. Jasmine offers to get food alone so the two of them can sleep in, especially since there's only like 3 of them to get food for anyway, but Sammy insists on going with her so they can hang out together. Amy, on the other hand, rudely wakes up Rodney so he can get food for her, and although Rodney tries to talk her into joining so they can have a romantic stroll together, Amy completely rejects the idea, so Rodney begrudgingly goes by himself. In the meantime, Sammy has a great time foraging with Jasmine because it's kind of the first time since she switched teams that they've really been able to hang out just one-on-one. Granted, she's a bit nervous to be alone with her at first, but once they fall back into their usual pattern of banter, Sammy eventually feels comfortable enough to bring up her concerns about their friendship. She admits to feeling neglected and scared that Jasmine will leave her now that she has a boyfriend, but thankfully Jasmine assures her that she values their friendship too much to abandon her. This comforts Sammy for the time being, so they share a brief hug before Rodney comes stumbling onto the scene looking like a mess. I can't imagine that. When Jasmine asks why he looks so ragged, Rodney explains that he's been running away from various animals the entire morning, all while trying to get food for Amy. He expresses his frustration that she didn't come with him since she easily could have helped him avoid this problem, but as usual, he excuses Amy's treatment of him by saying that these are just the burdens you expect when you enter a relationship. Sammy is alarmed to hear that Rodney is dating Amy and immediately suspects that her sister is just using him, but when she brings this up to Rodney, he gets very defensive. He doesn't want to believe that he's being manipulated, so he storms off to prove that he can talk things out with Amy like a normal couple. Unfortunately for him, Chris calls everyone to meet outside the island's junkyard before he has a chance to do that, though. Chris informs the players that, because of yesterday's little meltdown, some of the island's key components have been damaged and are in need of repair. That means they can't do most of the scheduled challenges until the island is fixed, but luckily there are some spare parts in the junkyard, and everything Chris forces the players to do doesn't count as unpaid labor. So for today's challenge, the contestants must find one of 5 replacement parts and bring it back to Chris. The first person to bring their component back wins immunity, but to make the game more challenging, Chris has also let loose some of his Chris bots to act as security guards. They're programmed to bring contestants back to the junkyard's penalty box for an indefinite amount of time, so it's best that they don't get caught. However, the overall point of this challenge is just to address the immediate consequences of the island's meltdown, unlike the real show which basically glossed over them until the finale. Once the challenge starts, Jasmine, Sean, and Sammy immediately begin to think of where to look for their first item. Sammy suggests splitting up so they can cover more ground, but Sean argues against this for the same reasons he usually does. Jasmine ultimately sides with Sammy this time since they only need one person to get immunity in order to eliminate Amy, but once the friends go their separate ways, Amy and Rodney reveal that they were spying on them the whole time. With the information they've gathered, Amy determines that following and sabotaging their opponents is kind of the best chance they have at winning since it allows them to narrow the competition while also getting the items that they need. However, when Rodney argues against doing something so unfair, Amy dismisses his concerns as usual and orders him to go after Jasmine while she follows her sister. This leads to the next few scenes just showing Amy and Rodney stalking their respective targets until Jasmine catches Rodney spying on her. He tries to play it cool so she doesn't learn what he's up to, but since Jasmine knows he's basically harmless, she offers to scavenge with him in hopes of bringing Rodney over to her side. I mean, she's never been overly concerned with maintaining team affiliations anyway, so I feel like it's fine. Meanwhile, Amy follows Sammy until she finally spots one of the missing components in a trash pile. The item is very far away, so Sammy spends a lot of time thinking about how to reach it while Amy plots against her, but once she comes to a conclusion, Sean conveniently slides onto the scene with an item already in hand. He had actually found it much earlier in the game and was just struggling to find his way to the entrance, but he stops to help Sammy since he's already here. Sammy is happy to have Sean's assistance, however, when it turns out that they have conflicting ideas for how to get the item, they get into a minor argument. Sammy insists on doing things her way since they're trying to reach the item she found, but Sean keeps pushing his idea since he believes it to be more practical. All the while, Amy uses this as an opportunity to lure security to their location, and after successfully getting the Crispbots to take Sean and Sammy away, Amy runs off with the key component Sammy was reaching for. As for Rodney and Jasmine, the pair continue to talk, except unlike their previous conversations, this one is actually going pretty well. Jasmine even compliments his improved social skills, and Rodney manages to keep it up until he lets his former crush on her slip out. Awkwardness ensues, and while Rodney tries to convince her that he's already in a happy relationship with Amy, it's clear to Jasmine that he's really just trying to convince himself that that's the case. So although Jasmine calms him down by saying that she believes him, she also makes sure to tell Rodney that he deserves to be happy whether he's in a relationship or not. This manages to strike a chord with Rodney, but right as he's about to reach an epiphany, Jasmine sees two of the missing items together in one spot and decides to get them. She hands one to Rodney for being such a good sport despite sort of being enemies, and so instead of sabotaging Jasmine like he was supposed to, Rodney decides to play fair and races her back to the entrance. Meanwhile, in the penalty box, Sean and Sammy keep trying to escape from their prison, but after several failed attempts, they eventually give up. Both of them gripe about their situation, but Sean insinuates that if they had chosen his plan, then they wouldn't be here in the first place. This leads Sammy to believe that Sean sabotaged her on purpose, so when she starts to accuse him of doing so, Sean is offended and decides to wait out the challenge on the other side of the pen. After he leaves, Sammy is lucky enough to stumble upon another key item on her side of the cell, but because she's still mad at Sean, she hides it from him. And if that wasn't enough, Amy also comes across the penalty box on her way to the entrance, and decides to endanger the competition to ensure her victory. I'm not sure what she'll do exactly, but it should be something that requires urgent attention. And so, after Amy is done employing her questionable tactics, she continues running back to the entrance. She almost manages to make it through, but since Jasmine and Rodney are traveling in the opposite direction, she bumps into them and breaks her item. Amy immediately starts insulting Jasmine, and the three argue over who's in the wrong, but when Amy reveals what she's done to Sean and Sammy, Jasmine rushes over to save them. So that just leaves Rodney and Amy, but while Rodney is ready to cross the finish line, Amy stops to scold him for letting Jasmine keep her item. Rodney explains that he wanted to play fair because, unlike Amy, Jasmine is actually respectful toward him, but Amy doesn't care and continues to berate him until she attracts the attention of the security bots and they both have to run. The scene then briefly cuts to Jasmine rescuing Sean and Sammy from jail before immediately returning back to Rodney and Amy hiding from security. When Chris announces the friend group's escape, Amy demands to have Rodney's item so she can at least try to save herself from elimination, but Rodney refuses to hand it over until they have a serious discussion about their relationship. This causes Amy to try deflecting, bargaining, and guilt-tripping Rodney into giving her what she wants, but Rodney's unwavering desire for a genuine answer remains firm, so he keeps pushing for a real answer and Amy continues to avoid the question until eventually she just goes into a full-blown tirade against Rodney and threatens to break up with him if he doesn't do what she says. This response leaves Rodney utterly heartbroken because it confirms that she never really cared about him and only wanted him for his strength. However, it also gives Rodney the clarity to finally stand up for himself when he sees a group of security bots pass by. As Amy is turned away from him, Rodney alerts the robots to her location, and so they drag her to the penalty box as he makes his way to the entrance. He eventually catches up to the friend group, and although he comes in last, the challenge ends because he's the one who brought the last item that's still intact. Amy is furious when she hears Chris announce the end of the challenge, and she even ends up toppling a nearby trash pile because of it. However, once the avalanche of garbage settles down, she sees something hidden in the trash heap indicated by an off-screen shine that quickly turns her mood around. So although everyone expects Amy to go home, Amy herself enters the elimination ceremony completely unbothered. Once Chris hands out the final marshmallow, everyone is excited to see Amy finally go, but before Chris can make it official, Amy pulls out the immunity idol she found at the last minute. This surprises everyone, aside from the audience members who were paying attention, and since her vote is the only one that matters, she decides to send Rodney home for betraying her. It's definitely unfair, but at least Rodney gets some closure with Jasmine and leaves with the satisfaction of having stood up to Amy. Episode 13. From this point forward, detail isn't as necessary to convey the story, so these last 3 episodes will actually be very brief. After arguing the last episode, Sean and Sammy start episode 13 fairly tense. Jasmine persuades them to work together early on, but their relationship remains pretty tenuous throughout the episode. Amy, on the other hand, is confident in her ability to win without Rodney, however, she also just needs to win so she doesn't get eliminated. The challenge will functionally be identical to the one from Skyfall. The contestants must hike to the top of a mountain, and the first to capture the flag from the summit wins immunity, while the last person to reach the top will be eliminated automatically. Since the mountain is artificial, booby traps will also be laid throughout the challenge, though the inclusion of these artificial elements is really just an excuse to tie things back to the setting like in the last episode. During the challenge, Amy manages to keep up with the friend group because Sean and Sammy's bickering slows their progress considerably. Jasmine works to mediate between them, but it just barely puts them in front of Amy for much of the game. They're eventually able to pick up the pace once they get to the rock climbing portion, since they're more focused on surviving than arguing. However, at the same time, Amy finds a shortcut that helps her bypass most of the climbing wall. So again, the groups are operating on a pretty even playing field until Jasmine eventually falls off the cliff like she did in Skyfall. She tells Sean and Sammy to keep going as she tries to regain her footing, but Jasmine ends up falling even further until she finally lands on Amy right as she exits her cave. Fortunately, she's still good to climb, but Amy pushes her into a nearby booby trap that prevents her from moving. Sean and Sammy try to save her, but end up arguing over how to do it, and as Amy makes her way up the rest of the cliff, circumstances propel Sean and Sammy to the summit where they get tangled in their climbing gear. They try to get untangled so at least one of them can grab the flag before Amy, but she manages to get to it first, and since everyone else is already at the finish line, that means Jasmine is the one going home. Episode 14. With her worst fears finally realized, episode 14 starts with Sammy pulling Sean aside to apologize for feuding with him. She explains how years of her sister's abuse have essentially trained her to perceive all criticism as mistreatment, so when Sean disagreed with her in episode 12, she felt personally attacked. He became an especially easy target to lash out on after Jasmine's relationship with Sean began to take priority over her friendship with Sammy, but after their infighting essentially secured Jasmine's elimination in the last episode, Sammy has come to realize just how harmful her insecurities have become, not only to Jasmine, but to Sean as well. So she apologizes to Sean right before he apologizes for his own contributions to their feud, and they both agree to stop fighting so they can avenge Jasmine together. Unfortunately, once the story gets around to the challenge, Sean and Sammy are worried when it turns out to be something that only Amy is really good at. The best I can come up with is some kind of point-based challenge that introduces increasingly elaborate methods of scoring as the game goes on, and then whoever reaches the high score first just obviously wins. I prefer that it takes place in a stationary location, so there aren't 3 racing episodes just back to back, but in any case, the challenge is mostly only designed this way to raise the stakes for Sammy and Sean. And so, as Amy completely dominates the first half of the game, Sammy and Sean work to undermine her in every way they can. It's a struggle at first, but by the second half, they realize that they can exploit Amy's ego by goading her into taking on the more dangerous goals. So, for example, if there's like a 100-point goal that requires Amy to jump through 100 flaming hoops, Sean will taunt her into doing it while Sammy racks up a bunch of smaller points. This escalates until Amy is pushed to do something that completely oversteps her limits, and she is forced to endure some form of pain or humiliation, as most total drama villains do, all while Sammy reaches the high score and wins the game. And so, in addition to her embarrassingly miserable failure, Amy must suffer the greatest indignity of all, as Sammy finally receives the honor of eliminating her for good this time. Episode 15. Now that Amy is finally out of the picture, there isn't really anything left to discuss other than the final challenge, so I guess I'll just get right into it. Similar to Action's finale, this season's final challenge will be a tour around the island so that the show has a chance to revisit all, or at least most, of the previous challenge sites. Unlike the real show, all of the locations will be altered by technology because I wanted to actually show the wonderful and bizarre dangers of the island's new landscape, as Chris put it. However, the exact alterations will vary. Some places will be frozen over, some will have extreme weather or terrain, and some will just be overrun with drones and lasers and stuff. But whatever the case is, there should be a notable twist to each area that changes the gameplay, like in a video game boss rush. Additionally, all eliminated contestants will return as spectators, but unlike the real finale, none of them will be helpers since Jasmine is pretty much the only relevant option for both finalists. As for their motivations, Sammy will use the money to study abroad to extend her time away from Amy, while Sean will use the money to fund an indie horror project or something. It doesn't actually matter who wins, since I still wrote this from the perspective that there'd be an alternate ending for each finalist, but if I had to pick a winner, I'd probably choose Sean over Sammy, since defeating Amy was already the culmination of her character arc. Of course, I'm not saying she doesn't deserve the money, but even in the worst case scenario, Sammy is more self-confident, she now has a stable support system to turn to, one of whom is now a millionaire, and she's humiliated Amy to the point that she'll never mess with her again. In any case, I feel like Sammy and Sean are both viable winners, and in general their dynamic is much more favorable than whatever Sean and Sky had going on in the real finale. Season 2. Now that I finally finished rewriting Pahkitew Island in excruciating detail, now it's time to make a second season in hopefully less excruciating detail. This isn't really necessary, but I've written about these versions of the characters for so long that I came up with ways to develop them past this initial season. I hope I can run down the details quickly because I don't want this video to be any longer than it already is, but let's be honest, it's probably still going to be long. To start, I want to separate the twins because they've already had enough drama, so Sammy, Sean, and Jasmine will be on Team A, while Amy will be on Team B. Rodney, Beardo, and Scarlett will also be on Team B so that Amy has to face everyone else she's wronged, whereas Sugar and Ella will continue their beef on Team A. Sugar and Ella will also befriend Topher and Leonard, respectively, so they'll also be on Team A, which means Sky, Dave, and Max have to round out Team B. This essentially means that Team A is composed of, the best and worst players from Season 1, whereas Team B consists of everyone in, the middle. And while I could have just explained it this way, I wanted to give some context for why the teams are configured this way. So, out of all of these characters, I think the first person to be eliminated should just be Max, because no one really likes him, and he's not a very useful teammate without the island's power at his disposal. The second person to be eliminated would then be Beardo, since he's essentially lived out his purpose as Rodney's sounding board. It's kind of disrespectful to his character, but the reason I made them friends in the first place was to give Rodney someone to talk to, and now that he can talk to girls, that role is no longer necessary. They'll still have a heartfelt goodbye, but that's about it for him. Next up is, surprisingly, Sammy, because there wouldn't be enough people to vote her off if she made it any further. I'm choosing Sammy specifically since she's arguably the most developed member of her friend group, but I tried to delay her elimination for as long as possible so she had more time to show off her new, healthier dynamic with Sean. As for the in-universe reason she gets voted off, I didn't want it to involve Amy since I felt that would cheapen Sammy's victory from the previous season. So instead I think her team should eliminate her for something more mundane, like she can't swim during an aquatic challenge, or she has to crawl through a spider-infested cave but she's arachnophobic or whatever. Coming in fourth again is Sugar. Similar to Max, she just isn't very useful, and her antagonistic relationship with Ella definitely doesn't help her case. However, I do want her sadistic, drama-driven personality to attract Topher, since that's exactly what he enjoys about Chris. I don't think it'll be a romantic attraction or anything. I kind of imagine Topher to be more like Sugar's pageant mom or something, but he will care about her when their team votes her off, and so even though Sugar is leaving at the same point in the game as last time, now at least she has a friend. After Sugar will be Amy. Scarlett and Rodney have obviously wanted her gone since the beginning, but her rotten personality and underhanded tactics will get her on Sky's bad side as well. I wanted to eliminate her at this specific point so Team A wouldn't have 3 eliminations in a row, but 6-ish episodes also just felt like a good amount of time to drag out her drama with Scarlett and Rodney. Episode 7 will probably be another non-elimination episode, so Chris can perform a team swap. I could have tacked this story beat onto the end of the previous episode, but doing it this way gives everyone's stories more time to breathe. Team A will get either Sky or Dave. I think I'm leaning more toward Dave. but the point is that they can't vote for each other directly, which motivates Dave to become even more aggressive. Meanwhile, Ella will be swapped onto Team B to kickstart her romantic subplot with Rodney. On Ella's end, I just kind of thought giving her a relationship would be nice, since she already wanted romance in the actual show. It's also kind of funny since they're both based on Disney characters. But for Rodney, it honestly seemed like the logical next step for his character after learning how to talk to girls and set boundaries. He'll probably avoid romance for the first few episodes after his experience with Amy, but over time he and Ella will be involved in multiple Disney-inspired scenes that bring them closer together. In any case, Sean will be the next character to go, and it's for pretty much the same reasons as Sammy. As a finalist, he doesn't have much to gain from going any further, and since it was Q the votes in his favor if someone else went first, he kind of has to leave now. So in order to justify his elimination, Sean will have some kind of phobia or skill issue that limits his participation in the game, and his teammates will vote him off for costing them the challenge. Either that or it's sabotage, but, whatever. The last elimination before the merge will be Leonard. Similar to Beardo, his main purpose is to give Ella someone to talk to.
Like how I've said before that Disney princesses always have the animal sidekick, and it's so they can say their thoughts out loud for the audience to know them. I call it being the flounder.
But now that she's on the opposite team, none of the votes are on his side. It's not like their friendship will be completely devoid of personality. In fact, I think it'd be kind of fun if they bonded over their love of acting, since this version of Ella is more of a theater kid than a straight-up Disney princess. But at the end of the day, Leonard just isn't a character with much utility beyond his acting and costume designing abilities. Past this, the next few entries get a little muddy, but the next contestant will probably be either Jasmine or Scarlett. They just don't have any other relevant relationships at this point, but I wanted to include them in the merge as an acknowledgement of their skills. After that, I want to eliminate Ella, but I specifically want Topher to orchestrate it, either to get Chris's attention or to satisfy his own sadism. He might also be targeting Ella as an extension of Sugar's hatred for her, but either way, he sees her and Rodney's relationship as a prime opportunity for drama. Topher will probably just trick Ella into thinking Rodney doesn't like her, so she'll quit, but he might take it a step further by digging up incriminating footage of Rodney, similar to what Chris did to Sean in the real finale. If Topher ends up doing the latter, then Rodney's main disagreement will probably be that he wants to spend $1 million on his family, while Ella wants to spend it on her school's theater department. It's kind of a weird meta approach to conflict where Topher is literally manufacturing drama, but I think it's kind of a unique motivation for a main villain that we haven't really seen before, and it's something that will kind of help him to stand out. Also, since Ella's throat was too damaged to sing during her first elimination, this season will finally give her the chance to sing her sad farewell song this time. For the 10th elimination, it's either Scarlett or Jasmine, whoever didn't go last time. Again, I don't have a good sense of why they're going, but this episode gives Rodney time to figure out what Topher did while also raising the tension between Sky and Dave. And with that in mind, loser number 11 will in fact be Dave after Sky finally puts a stop to his advances. As stated earlier in the video, Dave starts this season believing that he and Sky belong together, but after getting rejected just a few too many times, Dave eventually snaps and becomes increasingly hostile toward her as a result. Essentially, Dave has his incel arc. He basically serves as Sky's main rival for the entire season, since she didn't really have one in the first season or in the canon version of Pahkitew Island, and he probably gets eliminated in this episode because Rodney can't vote for Topher or something. Alternatively, maybe Dave was a part of Topher's scheme to get rid of Ella because he used to be friends with Rodney until he got a girlfriend, and so Rodney decides to vote for him along with Sky. But that brings us to the penultimate episode where Topher finally gets eliminated. I was originally going to put Dave here since I wanted him to be the main antagonist, but after considering how generally unthreatening he is and how much more interesting the Topher-Ella-Rodney dynamic was, I pivoted to making Topher the main villain instead. The exact mechanics of how he gets eliminated aren't really that important, but what is important is the build-up to this episode, which is why I delayed it as much as I did. Sky might also gang up on Topher for encouraging Dave to harass her, but other than that, I don't know how else to ramp up Topher's elimination without just rehashing the same, besties versus villain dynamic from the first season. Thankfully, I don't even have to rely on Topher's elimination for the climax because I can just rip off Pahkitew's real finale to compensate. So rather than hinging the entire season's resolution on Sky and Rodney's dynamic, their final obstacle will be their respective love interests instead. That means both finalists will be paired with a love interest, though to keep things balanced, I think it'd be best to pair them with the opposite character. That way Ella can slow Sky down with her sadness, while Dave pushes Rodney forward out of spite for Sky. All the while, Rodney will be trying to win Ella's trust back throughout the episode until she eventually forgives him about halfway through. But unfortunately, Chris then gives Ella and Dave control of the island, at which point Dave tries to hinder both finalists as Ella tries to protect them. Much like in the real finale, this all culminates once Dave appears to have killed both finalists, until both Sky and Rodney reveal themselves to be alive with one of them already past the finish line. If there's only one canonical ending, then Sky should definitely win since Rodney at least has Ella to fall back on, but if there are multiple endings, then I think Sky's sister and Rodney's dad should be flown in to watch them compete. That way, each finalist has someone around to comfort them when they lose, and maybe deliver some good news from home. Sky is in particular need for a character like this, since she doesn't have a friend or significant other to rely on, like Rodney, though that's honestly kind of my fault for pitting her against yet another couple. In fairness, I did consider using other characters to compete against Sky, but Scarlet isn't a good physical match for Sky despite her intelligence. Ella is nice enough to avoid elimination, but she's a bit gimmicky and therefore hard to take seriously. And while Jasmine could definitely go toe-to-toe with Sky, she doesn't have much to gain by winning, either personally or financially. So that really did only leave Rodney, who is similarly able to keep up with Sky, but also still has room to grow. Specifically, this season allows him to apply the lessons he's already learned about talking to girls and how to set boundaries, while simultaneously giving him the stable relationship he's been looking for since his introduction. As for Sky, I really just felt like she deserved a second chance at the money because on a purely competitive level, she has what it takes to win the game. This is already proven by the fact that she makes it all the way to the finale in the real show, but it's also just easy for her to avoid elimination since her generic girl-next-door personality helps to smooth out her interactions with most of the other contestants. Granted, that same nice girl personality is also what led fans to deride her for being a boring knockoff of Zoe, but hopefully her conflict with Dave in this season will give her a bit more of that friction that most of her interactions in the real show were missing. It's basically their relationship from episodes 9 and 13, but stretched out for longer. After this, though, I don't think this specific cast could have another season since they've essentially run out of viable finalists and villains. Scarlet is pretty much the only one competent enough to fill either role at this point, but like I said earlier, she still suffers from a lack of chemistry with most of the other contestants. Even if they were included in a second All-Star season, because, the first one had to have happened in order for Pahkitew to exist in the first place, I feel like the older contestants have already exhausted most of their opportunities for character development, but honestly that's kind of why creating a spin-off was such a stroke of genius, because it gave the writers room to experiment and use older characters just without the baggage of needing to be an all-star. So if I could make a suggestion, I would just periodically introduce a new spin-off anytime the main series became stale. That way old characters could get a second life on the spin-off series, while spin-off characters could then join the main series for brand synergy. Doing so would also increase the longevity of the franchise overall, because it would give the main total drama series an alternative to just pumping out another All-Star season every time they introduce a new cast. Conclusion. I'm gonna be honest, this was not the most fun video for me to write. I like the overall ideas I came up with, but for some reason I struggled a lot more than usual to organize my thoughts into coherent sentences this time. Even besides school, I just had to take several breaks and move on to other videos because I probably would have lost my mind if I had to think about this season for 18 months straight. It's not even that this season really upsets me anymore, I just got really exhausted from trying to articulate my thoughts in a way that sounded correct to me. It's difficult to word things properly when you have to put so many different ideas together, and with that in mind, I think another reason I struggled so much with this video is that I had to create a lot more original ideas for this rewrite compared to my first one. Like, most of the changes and additions in my All-Stars video were inspired by events that actually happened in the show, but I feel like 70% of the concepts in this video were essentially made from scratch. In fairness, a lot of that is just because I wanted to be more thorough with the episode descriptions and challenge ideas, but I only did that because I felt it was necessary to illustrate all the changes I made to the cast. And I changed the cast a lot, just because they're basically new characters in the same way that Mal was kind of a new character. So in contrast to my All-Stars rewrite, which really only moved characters around by like 1 or 2 places, I essentially ended up with an entirely new season for Pahkitew. And ultimately, I think that ties back to why I've always ranked Pahkitew Island below All-Stars in the first place. The main line of argument against Pahkitew being the worst season is that at least it doesn't ruin beloved characters. But in my opinion, Pahkitew starts on so many bad premises that a good execution of its core concepts is nearly impossible without heavy revisions, which I'd argue is worse. I don't know, maybe it's a bit shallow to judge these seasons based on what they could have been rather than what they are, And at least part of my preference for All-Stars is probably rooted in nostalgia, which naturally makes the characters in that show more engaging to watch compared to the ones in Pahkitew. But if you want to determine for yourself whether All-Stars or Pahkitew is worse, I guess it really just comes down to a question of which season you would change more. But with all that out of the way, that's the end of the video. I'm glad that it's finally over, not in the sense that I feel joy, but in the sense that I can finally sleep at night without the fear of this 18-month-long project becoming a 2-year-long project. However, I'm also just hoping that this video will satisfy people's requests for a Pahkitew Island rewrite just in general. For the sake of clarity, no, I will not rewrite the other seasons because the rest of them are fine. I think the reboot is especially good, so please do not bother asking me for another one of these. But other than that, I guess that's a wrap. God, if Switchy releases his Pahkitew roast before this, I'm gonna be so pissed. So going back to that idea of, like, laying out the franchise, if I was planning out the series from the start, I probably would have changed, like, the 4th season so that it took place on a new island to go along with the new cast. The first 3 seasons can stay the same, but the Revenge cast never really got a chance to fully escape their predecessors, so that's why I would try to carve out a more unique identity for them. From there, I would give them a follow-up season so we can spend more time with them before moving on to the 3rd cast for another 2 seasons, and then, after all 3 casts have accumulated a decent amount of development, that's when I would bring them back to Camp Wawanakwa for an all-star season. After that, I would start pivoting toward a spin-off series, since immediately introducing a 4th cast would probably be too predictable by this point. And with that spin-off as a palate cleanser, I would then return to the main series, with the next cast still playing on Camp Wawanakwa for nostalgia, maybe under the name Revenge of the Island to emphasize that it's round 2 in the same location. But speaking of location, I can't think of any that are remote yet diverse enough for challenges other than, like, an abandoned theme park. But maybe at a certain point Chris will make the show international, with each season just taking place in a different country that they just tour around. That way they aren't always on an island, and the show gets the benefits of World Tour's travel vibe just on a smaller scale. As for the spin-offs, they'll continue releasing periodically as an alternative to the All-Star seasons, until they get popular enough to warrant a sequel, or unpopular enough to start pumping out completely new spin-offs, and then you just kind of rinse and repeat.